Because of a staged miscarriage orchestrated by his mistress to seize his assets, my husband blindly allowed me to be wrongly convicted for 2 long years. On the day I was released from prison in a torrential rain, he avoided appearing instead, sending his assistant to bring money and the penthouse keys to greet me. But the game of destruction against the villains had only just begun. This story won't leave you unchanged. Before we continue, drop a quick comment. Have you ever had to choose between revenge and peace? A for revenge, B for peace. Your perspective might be exactly what someone else needs. Quick note, some details are fictionalized to bring the message to life. What stays with you is what truly matters. They gave me 2 years for a crime that never happened. A miscarriage that was never real, staged by a woman who could never get pregnant. The prison gates screeched open into October rain. I stepped through as inmate 4729B for the last time, rubber sandals slapping wet concrete, releasing clothes soaked before I reached the curb. I was Calla Mercer, 30 years old, former financial analyst, now a ghost the world had already forgotten. A black navigator idled at the curb. Ethan Pierce, Julian's executive assistant, stood beside it holding an umbrella over empty air, his expensive suit already ruined by the downpour. "Mrs. Ashford," he called. "Mr. Julian couldn't make it. Board meeting. He's prepared everything, penthouse in Tribeca, black Amex cash for daily expenses." He held out a key card and a thick envelope. Water streamed off the leather. I took them both, felt their weight. 730 days of weight. "Tell Julian," I said, my voice raw from 2 years of deliberate silence. The Calla he knew died in there. Then I walked to the storm drain 3 feet away and dropped everything through the grate. Keys jangled against iron. The envelope hit standing water below with a dull, wet thump. Ethan's face went white. "Ma'am, that's everything." "No," I said, "that's nothing." I left him standing in the rain and walked 4 blocks to the bus stop. My sandals left bloody prints on the sidewalk. A musty Q46 pulled up 20 minutes later, and I rode it into Queens water, dripping from my hair onto seats that smelled like decades of commuters who had never seen the inside of a cell. "You think I threw those keys because I was angry? You're wrong. I threw them because I already knew something Ethan didn't. That Tribeca penthouse Julian offered as a grand gesture, he'd mortgaged it to Deutsche Bank 3 months ago to cover margin calls. I'd tracked his positions through contraband phones and favors traded in the prison library. 730 days of listening, memorizing, planning. The bus dropped me in Jackson Heights as daylight bled into evening. I found the basement room I'd arranged before release, cash only, no questions. The landlord handed me a key without looking at my face. The room was exactly what I needed. A mattress on concrete, one window at sidewalk level, a bare bulb that made everything look sick. At the bottom of my prison duffel, one photo of Martha Mercer, my grandmother, strong hands on her hips, standing on Vermont land she'd protected for 40 years. She had died while I was locked away. I let one tear fall, the last weakness I would allow myself. Then I picked up the phone and dialed. One ring. "Jerome," I said, "it's me." His voice was steady, completely unsurprised. "I've been waiting 2 years for this call. We start tonight." He already knew what we were starting. The question was whether Julian had any idea what was coming. Jerome's plan would wait 3 days before I understood what we were really starting. 3 days into freedom. I was invisible. A ghost in a janitor's uniform, mopping floors for people who once took my investment advice. The industrial bleach smell burned my throat at 6 in the morning as I pushed my cart through the downtown Brooklyn commercial building where hedge fund analysts arrived in $1,000 suits, stepping around my mop bucket without seeing my face. I scrubbed methodically. Baseboards, elevator panels, bathroom mirrors that reflected nothing of who I used to be. The work was perfect. Not because I cared about clean floors, but because invisibility requires precision. Ex-cons who do sloppy work get noticed, get questioned, get fired. I needed to disappear completely. "Hey," Frank Gorman, 52, my cleaning supervisor with a beer gut and a talent for finding fault, stood over me, barking about coffee stains as if I were deaf and stupid. "There's still a coffee stain in the corner. Are you blind?" I looked up from where I'd been scrubbing grout lines with a toothbrush. "Yes, sir, I'm sorry." "You're lucky we hired you at all with your record," he said loudest when executives were nearby to hear him flex authority over the ex-convict. "Don't make me regret it." No, sir. I dropped to my knees, immediately found the coffee stain barely visible, deliberately obscure and scrubbed until my knuckles bled through the thin yellow gloves. Frank watched for 30 seconds to establish dominance, then waddled away satisfied. The executive who'd spilled the coffee walked past without a glance. I'd analyzed his portfolio 2 years ago, recommended the biotech play that made him $250,000. He had no idea the woman scrubbing his mistakes had once been Callum Mercer, analyst Martha's granddaughter, somebody. Now I was nobody, exactly as planned. You want to know the real punishment of prison? It's not the bars. It's coming out and realizing the world moved on without you. Your husband got richer, your enemies got bolder, and nobody remembers your name. But here's what they don't teach you in those 730 days: being nobody is the greatest disguise you'll ever wear. Nobody watches nobodies. Nobody questions the janitor's access to empty offices at dawn. I hadn't taken this job just to survive. I'd taken it to learn how to be a ghost. The morning stretched into its fifth hour. My cart rolled past glass offices where people made decisions that moved millions. Trading floors, conference rooms, bathrooms where women in Louboutins fixed makeup while I cleaned toilets they'd just used. The fluorescent lights never changed. 6 a.m. looked exactly like 9 a.m. in artificial brightness that erased time. I was working the executive floor hallway, methodically mopping tiles that cost more per square foot than my basement room cost per month when I saw it. A newspaper, discarded on the floor near a trash can. Wall Street Journal finance section, yesterday's edition that someone had read and abandoned like it meant nothing. I kept mopping toward it, casual, unremarkable. Just the cleaning woman doing her job, pushing dirty water across expensive tile, getting closer to the trash where newspapers belong. The headline caught my eye 3 feet away. Vance Capital plans Vermont expansion. I stopped breathing. My mop kept moving, automatic, mechanical. But my eyes locked on that newsprint like it was a court summons. Vance Capital CEO Julian Ashford confirmed the firm's aggressive expansion into Vermont ecological real estate, targeting remaining Green Mountains parcels in what analysts call a strategic pivot toward sustainable luxury development. Acquisition of remaining Green Mountains parcels expected to complete by November 15, positioning Vance Capital as the dominant landowner in the region's conservation corridor. Green Mountains, Martha's land, the trust she'd built over 40 years, protecting every acre from exactly this kind of predatory acquisition. I wasn't just holding what he had, he was actively taking more. Right now, this morning, while I scrubbed floors, I bent down like I was checking for dirt, brought my face close to the text. Read it 3 times, memorized every word. November 15, 6 weeks from now. That wasn't random. Jerome had mentioned a family council meeting. I'd thought we had time to prepare, to strategize, to build a case slowly and carefully. But Julian was moving fast, accelerating. He wanted Martha's land locked down before I could do anything about it, before anyone realized the trust existed, before the woman he'd sent to prison could come back from the dead. Emma, Martha's land, my land, our legacy. He was stealing it right now, this morning, while I scrubbed his world's coffee stains. The article continued with details about financing environmental impact studies that were clearly purchased, rubber stamps, projected returns. Every word was Julian's voice in my head, smooth and confident, explaining why this made perfect business sense, while erasing the only thing Martha had ever asked me to protect. This wasn't about money, I whispered to the empty hallway. This was about erasing every trace of Martha from the earth. My hands tightened on the mop handle until the wood creaked. 6 weeks. November 15. The deadline wasn't theoretical anymore. It was a countdown timer I could hear ticking in my skull. I stood slowly, carefully, looked around the hallway. Security camera in the corner, but it pointed at the elevator, not at the trash area. No one watching. No one here at all except the invisible janitor and her ghosts. I placed the newspaper back exactly where I'd found it, folded the same way, positioned at the same angle. No evidence I'd touched it, no reason for anyone to wonder if the cleaning woman could read. Picked up my mop, dipped it in the bucket, continued down the hall with the same steady rhythm I'd maintained for 3 days. But everything had changed. Jerome said we'd start tonight. I'd been wrong. We'd already started the moment I walked out of those prison gates. The janitor job wasn't preparation. The basement room wasn't hiding. Every invisible day was reconnaissance. Every humiliation was camouflage. Every hour spent mopping floors was an hour spent learning how to move through the world like I didn't exist. Now I just needed to get back inside Julian's mansion, access his files, find out exactly how he planned to steal Martha's land, stop him before November 15th. And I knew exactly how to make him beg me to come home. The mop hit the tile with steady rhythmic splashes, water, bleach, repeat, the sound of somebody who'd accepted her place in the world. But I wasn't somebody anymore. I was nobody. And nobody was going to burn his empire to the ground. 1 week after the newspaper, Jerome spread financial charts across his desk, like a battlefield map, and for the first time since prison, I saw the full scope of what Martha had left me to fight with. His law office was small but deliberate mahogany desk, warm reading lamp air, thick with leather and old coffee. Financial district 20th floor window view of buildings where Julian's peers worked. Your grandmother was brilliant, he said, tapping a highlighted figure. The Vermont fund is currently worth $47 million. I'd known it was substantial. I hadn't known it had nearly tripled. She managed it during your imprisonment, Jerome continued. Real estate trusts, conservation easements, selective development rights. She structured everything so Julian couldn't touch it directly, even if he knew it existed. But he's attacking anyway, I said. Civil litigation, claiming abandoned property since Martha's death. He's trying to force a court-ordered sale of the remaining parcels before anyone realizes you're the beneficiary. The charts showed timelines, legal motions, acquisition targets. Julian's fingerprints everywhere. Aggressive, methodical, expensive. November 15th, Jerome said. Family council meeting. If Julian presents the Vermont parcels as completed before then, the council rubber stamps it. Once that happens, reversing it becomes 10 times harder. 6 weeks. The prenuptial, I said. You mentioned it had teeth. Jerome's face changed. The lawyer disappeared, replaced by something sharper. Martha insisted on a fidelity clause when you married Julian. She didn't trust him. I should have listened. The clause states that proof of adultery, verified, documented, incontrovertible, triggers immediate asset transfer. All of Julian's personal shares in Vance Capital revert to you. Not the family trust shares, but his personal stake, roughly 38% of his net worth. I felt something click in my chest. A mechanism I'd been building for 2 years suddenly finding its missing gear. How much proof? I asked. Medical records, photographic evidence, testimony from credible witnesses. The standard is high because the penalty is devastating, but if you have it. I have it. Jerome stopped. What? Medical records. Geneva International Medical Center. Victoria Sinclair had a total hysterectomy in March 2020, 18 months before she claimed to have a miscarriage. I have the surgical notes, post-operative reports, medication logs, everything. $47 million. Martha had turned her modest Vermont investment into a fortune while I rotted in a cell, not despite my absence but as protection against it. She'd known. She'd prepared. And now she'd given me the weapon to make Julian bleed from every financial artery he had. Jerome stared at me. Those records are sealed. Even private investigators couldn't. How did you get them? Let's take a walk, I said. We ended up in a subway cafe near Grand Central. Cheap coffee, cracked tile trains rumbling beneath our feet. Crowded enough that no one paid attention. Anonymous enough that no one would remember. I waited until Jerome took a sip, then laid it out. Month 6 in prison. I hired someone, a medical records consultant, who had legally obtained copies of the Geneva files through an international patient rights request. Victoria was the listed patient. Under Swiss privacy law, the request could only be fulfilled through a designated legal intermediary. That intermediary contacted Geneva on behalf of a client who had standing. The records were delivered through proper channels. The process took 4 months. Jerome didn't need to know every step. What mattered was that the records existed, they were legally obtained, and they were irrefutable. So is framing someone for a crime they didn't commit. I paid her with every dollar I earned in the prison laundry for 18 months. $3 a day, 6 days a week. It took her 4 months to get the files without triggering audit flags. Jerome set his cup down carefully. You orchestrated this from inside. The day I was released, those records were delivered to Julian's desk at Vance Capital, anonymously. No return address. Just Victoria's surgical history proving she lied about everything. I didn't know this, Jerome said quietly. No one needed to know. You were building the legal framework. I was building the ammunition. You want to know what prison really teaches you, not survival. Strategy. When you have nothing but time and a concrete floor, your mind becomes the only weapon that matters. Every conversation in the laundry, every newspaper in the library, every visiting lawyer who talked too loud about cases that had nothing to do with mine. I absorbed it all, built a mental map of exactly how the world worked while everyone assumed I was just serving time. I wasn't serving time, I was preparing for war. Jesus, Jerome breathed. You sent them to him directly. I wanted him to know someone was watching, someone had evidence, someone was coming. Let him spend the last week sweating, wondering who had the records, what else they knew when the next shoe would drop. Jerome looked at me across the cheap table with its ring stains and sugar packets, really seeing me for the first time since I'd gotten out. The woman in the janitor's uniform. The ex-convict with bleeding knuckles in a basement room. The ghost who cleaned toilets and said yes sir and disappeared. I thought I was helping you, he said. I smiled, the first real smile in 2 years. It felt strange on my face, like muscles remembering forgotten movements. You are helping me, Jerome. But I was never the client. I was always the general. I sat back processing, recalculating everything he thought he knew about the woman who'd called him from a basement room. What's the next move? He asked. I need to know Julien's allies. Everyone on the family council, everyone in his inner circle, everyone who'd stand with him when this goes nuclear, because it will go nuclear. That's a lot of people to turn. I don't need to turn all of them, I said. Just enough to make him bleed. The question wasn't whether we could win. The question was how many of Julien's allies I'd need to turn first, and how much they'd cost me when the time came. But that was a question for tomorrow. Tonight I'd finally shown Jerome that his old college roommate hadn't just survived prison. She'd weaponized it. The most dangerous alliances are built on mutual hatred. I just never expected Julien's own uncle to walk through that hotel lobby and offer me the knife to cut his nephew's throat. 2 weeks had passed since Jerome learned I was the general, not the client. 2 weeks of careful invisibility, mopping floors, gathering intelligence. Then Raymond Ashford, 55, Julian's uncle and former Vance Capital board member, approached me in a midtown hotel lobby, chosen specifically because no one from our old world would recognize us there. I wore an expensive suit that couldn't hide the bitterness in his eyes. Ousted from the family council 3 years ago, when Julian consolidated power, left with a generous severance and a lifetime of resentment. I know about the Vermont Fund, he said without preamble, settling into the chair across from me like we'd planned this meeting. 47 million. Your grandmother was smarter than my nephew ever realized. I kept my face blank. What do you want? The same thing you want. Julian, removed from power, stripped of everything he built on other people's backs. Raymond's smile was thin and sharp. I provide family council insider intelligence, voting patterns, financial vulnerabilities, who's loyal and who can be turned. You provide the evidence that destroys him. And your price. The CEO chair after Julian's removed, nothing more, nothing less. I thought of Martha's voice teaching me at 22 about negotiation. My grandmother used to say the most venomous snake is sometimes the most useful snake if you know how to hold it in the right place. Raymond laughed, but it had no warmth. Martha understood power. Julian never did. He thought he could steal it, but real power is built on alliances. Alliances built on revenge aren't alliances, I said. They're temporary ceasefires. Then we understand each other perfectly. He slid a manila envelope across the table. Inside, family council voting records, financial statements showing Julian's leverage over board members, internal memos about the Vermont acquisition. Information worth more than money, because it showed me exactly where Julian was vulnerable. He's been watching you since you got out, Raymond said quietly, waiting to see if you'd come crawling back or make a move. This Vermont play. It's partly about the land, partly about forcing your hand. He wants you desperate enough to negotiate. I don't negotiate from weakness. No, Raymond said, standing. You weaponize it. That's why I'm betting on you. We shook hands. His grip was cold, calculating exactly what I expected. This wasn't friendship. This was mutual destruction with aligned interests. Then you win a war with allies you don't trust. Martha would say yes, as long as you never turn your back on them and keep your hand closer to the knife than theirs. 1 week later, I met Denise Frost, 45, the former Ashford estate housekeeper Julian fired on Victoria's orders, on an isolated bench in a Queen's Park where evening joggers passed without seeing us. She carried a worn leather bag and the haunted look of someone who'd seen too much and stayed silent too long. When Victoria wanted her gone, Julian complied without questions. 12 years of loyal service ended with a severance check and an NDA she'd never signed. "You know what she did to you," Denise said, hands shaking slightly as she pulled documents from the bag. "The fake pregnancy, the trial, all of it, but you don't know about the insurance." My pulse quickened. "What insurance?" "Victoria didn't just destroy you personally." Denise spread papers across the bench between us: claim forms, bank statements, medical certifications. She filed a claim, $240,000 from HealthGuard Premier for pregnancy loss complications and emotional trauma. The words hit me like physical blows. She got paid for framing me. Worse. The doctor who signed her medical certification, Dr. Neil Prescott, was chief medical examiner at HealthGuard at that exact time. He approved his own fraudulent claim. Massive conflict of interest, completely illegal. $240,000. Stolen from an insurance pool that working families paid into for protection. Victoria didn't just destroy my life, she robbed everyone who ever paid a premium, turned systemic trust into personal profit, committed fraud that rippled through thousands of innocent policyholders. "Do you have proof?" I asked, my voice steady despite the rage building in my chest. "Everything." Denise tapped the documents. "Policy number, claim forms, transfer receipts. I made copies before Victoria fired me. She didn't know I kept them." "Why now? Why wait 3 years?" Denise looked toward the cemetery, visible beyond the park fence. Iron gates and weathered stones catching twilight. "Because Victoria fired me the day after your grandmother's funeral. She didn't want witnesses who remembered Martha was still fighting for that Vermont land until her last breath." Something cold settled in my chest. Martha, the land, always the land. "She told Mr. Julian I was stealing," Denise continued, voice bitter. "Made up lies about missing jewelry, credit card fraud. He believed her without question, had security escort me out like a criminal. 12 years of service and he didn't even ask my side." "But you kept the documents." "I kept everything. Every conversation I overheard, every suspicious phone call, every time Victoria laughed about how easy it was to fool everyone." Denise's hands steadied as she pushed the folder toward me. "I wanted justice. I just didn't know how to get it until I heard you were out." I took the folder, felt its weight. This wasn't just ammunition. This was transformation. Personal revenge elevated to systemic justice. Individual vendetta expanded to protecting millions of people who'd never know their premiums funded Victoria's fraud. "Thank you," I said. Denise stood adjusting her bag. "Martha was kind to me. Always remembered my birthday, asked about my daughter. When she died, I cried more than her own family did." She paused. "Make them pay for what they did to her, and to you." She walked away into the gathering dark, just another anonymous figure in a city full of people carrying secrets. I sat alone on that bench, holding documents that changed everything. Victoria's crime wasn't just personal anymore. It was federal. It was systematic. It was the kind of fraud that brought prosecutors running and made headlines that destroyed reputations beyond repair. The land. Martha fighting until her last breath. Victoria removing witnesses. Julian stealing Vermont parcels. It was all connected, always had been. I just hadn't seen the full picture until now. 4 weeks after learning everything was connected, he came to Martha's grave carrying a map of everything he was about to steal, and I let him think forcing me back to his mansion was his idea. Calvary Cemetery in Queens. Martha's makeshift wooden cross marked cheap earth where she'd been buried while I rotted in a cell. No headstone, no permanent marker. Just weathered wood with her name burned into the grain. Julian Ashford, 34, stood there in a $1,000 suit, holding a rolled map, the man who'd signed my life away, finally face to face with what he'd done. Fine lines around his eyes, gray threading his temples. Wedding ring still on his finger like he had any right to wear it. "I didn't think you'd come," he said. My hands trembled. Real fear at seeing him upright and free while I'd counted 730 days in a cell. Authentic reactions make the best weapons. "You sent the address," I managed. "I wanted to talk, away from lawyers." He unrolled the map against Martha's cross. Vermont. Green mountains. Development zones in red. The final parcels transfer November 15th. Your grandmother's land becomes Vance Capital property. unless you sign over your trust claim voluntarily. November 15th, 6 weeks away. Not just a meeting date, the exact legal deadline when automatic transfer occurred. No extensions, no appeals. A hard stop built into the land trust decades ago, never imagining I'd be imprisoned when it mattered. You can't, I whispered. I can, I am. It's already in motion. He looked at me, then really looked. Guilt flickered behind the business presentation. But I wanted you to hear it from me first. My breathing accelerated, chest tight, vision narrowing, PTSD panic attack coming triggered by his proximity and Martha's grave and the map showing everything I was losing. I hyperventilated, bent double, genuine terror. And in that authentic moment I made my move. Let me come back, I gasped. To the estate, I need 6 weeks, just 6 weeks. Julian stared. What? The basement room is killing me. I can't breathe there. I just need. I looked up through tears that were absolutely real. 6 weeks, until November 15th. Then I'll sign whatever you want. He stood frozen, calculating, trying to see the trap. But there was none he could find. Just a broken woman begging for temporary shelter in exchange for surrender. I'll call Jerome, he said finally. Jerome arrived within 30 minutes. The cohabitation contract was simple. I could leave any time. Julian couldn't restrict my movement, separate bedrooms, no financial obligations. Jerome read each clause while I signed with shaking hands. As Julian walked to his car, Jerome leaned close. The trap is set. I nodded once. Here's what you need to understand about PTSD. It's real. The vomiting, the floor, sleeping, the panic attacks, all absolutely genuine. Prison rewires your brain. But just because pain is real doesn't mean it can't also be useful. The best manipulation uses truth as its foundation. That night, Greenwich Estate, massive and echoing, marble floors, vaulted ceilings, wealth that whispered. Dinner in the formal dining room. Julian ordered comfort food, meatloaf, mashed potatoes, green beans. The kitchen brought it on china worth more than my monthly prison wages. The smell hit me before the plate reached the table. Meat, cooked meat. Prison trays where flies laid eggs, where I'd found maggots writhing in gravy. I vomited, violently, all over the antique rug. Julian moved fast. No disgust, no anger. It's okay, he said, waving away horrified staff. I can't, the smell. It smells like the prison trays. There were maggots in the meat. It's okay, I'll get you toast. Plain toast. Is that okay? I nodded, shaking. He brought it himself. No butter, no jam. Just warm bread on a clean plate. Sat across from me in silence while I ate with trembling hands. Later, past midnight, I couldn't sleep in the guest bedroom's massive bed. Too soft, too open, too much space where danger could approach. I found the narrow gap between the wardrobe and wall, maybe 18 inches wide. I curled there in my nightgown on the hardwood floor, fetal position, exactly like prison bunks, barely wide enough to turn over. Safety wasn't comfort. Safety was confinement I could control. I heard his footsteps. Julian checking on me, finding the empty bed. Then silence as he discovered me wedged in that impossible space. My nightgown had slipped. I knew it had. The keloid scars across my back were visible, raised tissue from where I'd been whipped by a guard who didn't like my face. 3 circular cigarette burns near my shoulder blade, where another inmate had decided I looked too proud. I heard him make a sound, choked, broken. What have I done? He whispered. God, what have I done to you? He cried, silently trying to muffle it, but I heard everything. Guilt finally landing, reality finally penetrating. I didn't feel satisfied. I didn't feel vindicated. I just thought, you're becoming the most useful tool in my plan and you don't even know it. I stayed perfectly still, breathing steady, faking sleep, letting him see, letting him carry this image back to his bedroom, where he'd lie awake wondering how the woman he'd married had become this broken thing on his floor. Tomorrow he'd start questioning everything. Victoria's story, the trial, the evidence that put me away. Tomorrow he'd begin investigating the woman he was sleeping with exactly as I needed him to. But tonight I lay in that narrow space long after his footsteps faded, listening to the house settle. He thought I was broken. He thought he was witnessing my destruction. What he was actually witnessing was the opening move of a game he didn't know we were playing. Tomorrow, while he was at the office, I'd find his computer password, and I already knew what it would be: Martha's birthday. He'd never changed it, too sentimental about the grandmother who'd never trusted him. The hunter had invited the wolf into his home. Now I just needed to find where he kept the keys to his empire. Day 3 at the estate. I entered Julian's office while he sat in his Manhattan tower, thinking I was sleeping off another nightmare. The password to Julian's computer was Martha's birthday, the same grandmother whose land he was stealing, whose memory he claimed to honor, whose legacy he was destroying one legal filing at a time. His private study smelled like leather and old wood, curtains drawn against afternoon light, single desk lamp illuminating mahogany workspace, and the locked computer that held everything I needed. I tried the password I'd known for years, the one he'd never changed through our entire marriage because he was sentimental about the woman who'd never fully trusted him. November 7, 1930s and Martha's birthday. The screen unlocked immediately. Inside internal Vance Capital emails, organized by project folder. Vermont acquisition. Legal compliance. Client portfolio management. He'd filed his crimes alphabetically, labeled them like they were legitimate business operations. I opened client portfolio management first. There it was. Email chain between Julian and his chief financial officer dated 6 months ago, discussing temporary reallocation of retirement fund assets to cover short-term acquisition financing. Corporate language for theft. $12 million diverted from employee retirement accounts to cover Vermont land purchase losses when his leveraged positions went wrong. Dodd-Frank violations, federal crime, 5-year minimum sentence. He'd documented his own destruction, filed it neatly, password protected it with his dead grandmother's birthday like that would keep him safe. $12 million from employee retirement accounts, I whispered to the empty room. Federal violation, 5 years minimum. You documented your own crime, Julian. I photographed each email with my phone. 15 pages, 20. Compressed the files, sent them encrypted to Jerome with a single word message, evidence. Then I heard it. Car engine in the driveway. Early. 3 hours too early. Julian was home. I closed the email program. Restored the screensaver. Mouse positioned exactly 3 inches from keyboard edge where it had been. No fingerprints on the mahogany. Curtains returned to the exact angle they'd been drawn. I slipped out of the study and into the hallway bathroom just as the front door opened. "Kala," he called. "In here," I answered, running water in the sink like I'd been washing my hands. "Just woke up." He appeared in the bathroom doorway, loosened tie, briefed exhaustion. "How are you feeling?" "Better, the sleep helped." He smiled, relieved. "Good, that's good." I'd been in his computer for 43 minutes. He had no idea. He kept her birthday as his password. Martha. The woman who raised me, who built that Vermont fund to protect me, whose land he was seizing parcel by parcel. He loved her. I know he did. That's what made this so much worse. He was capable of love and theft simultaneously. Not a monster. Just a man who'd convinced himself every crime was justified, every betrayal was business, every victim was collateral damage in a war only he was fighting. 2 days later, morning sunlight streamed through the estate kitchen windows. Smell of fresh coffee, real beans, the kind that cost more per pound than prison inmates earned in a month. Julian had made breakfast, first time since I'd moved back. Scrambled eggs and toast, carefully avoiding meat after watching me vomit at dinner earlier that week. "Remember our Bodega coffee in Queens?" he asked, setting a plate in front of me. $20 for the week, and we thought we were rich when we could afford cream. I smiled at precisely the right moment. Soft, nostalgic, the woman who remembered loving him before everything fell apart. We had that terrible apartment with the radiator that clanked all night. You said it sounded like ghosts arguing. He laughed. Actually laughed like we were normal people with normal memories, instead of a broken woman, and the man who'd destroyed her plotting against each other at a breakfast table, worth more than that entire Queens building. I performed warmth I didn't feel, nodded, ate toast, played the role perfectly. "The Plaza Gala is next Wednesday," Julian said, refilling my coffee. "All the major donors. Would you want to come show everyone you're okay?" He meant well. Wanted to parade his reformed marriage, his forgiven wife, proof that he was generous enough to take back the woman he'd sent to prison. Redemption theater for the benefit of people who wrote checks with 6 zeros. I seized the opening. "Invite Victoria too," I said quietly. Julian's cup stopped halfway to his mouth. "What?" "I want to show everyone I'm not afraid of her. That she didn't break me." I met his eyes, let him see what he wanted to see. Courage, healing strength. If I can stand in the same room with the woman who destroyed my life and hold my head up, it proves I'm really recovering. His face transformed, shock, then something deeper, pride maybe, admiration for the brave broken woman choosing forgiveness over fear. Are you sure? He asked. I'm sure. Invite her. I want her to see me standing beside you healthy whole. I want her to know she didn't win. You want to know the difference between a victim and a strategist? A victim would refuse to sit at the same table as her husband's mistress. A strategist invites the mistress personally and watches her walk straight into the trap. Julian reached across the breakfast table, took my hand, squeezed gently. Gratitude in his eyes for my apparent strength, my willingness to face my demons, my incredible capacity for forgiveness. I squeezed back, smiled, played the role perfectly. What he didn't know, I'd already texted Dominic the gala date the moment Julian mentioned it. Dominic Rawlings, the tech specialist. Jerome had connected me with the man who could install audio equipment in a Plaza Hotel bathroom without security noticing, who could make sure every word Victoria spoke would broadcast to 300 donors in crystal clear quality. Victoria would walk into that bathroom thinking she was untouchable, thinking she'd won, thinking the broken woman at the gala was just Julian's pitiful wife playing dress up and pretending to be strong. She was wrong. Patience wasn't something I'd been born with. Martha had spent years drilling it into me sitting beside her in Vermont, watching her study land records for hours before making a single move. Place the microphone in the right place and wait for them to speak. The guilty always confess when they think no one's listening. The trap was set. Victoria couldn't refuse an invitation from Julian and his supposedly forgiving wife. Society wouldn't allow it. Pride wouldn't allow it. She'd come to the plaza wearing designer armor, and that arrogant smile ready to prove she could stand in the same room with the woman she'd destroyed. And I'd be waiting. The plaza trap was set, but traps are only useful if the prey walks into them at exactly the right moment. What I needed now was intelligence about when the ship was actually sinking. The first rat always leaves before the ship actually sinks. Smart rats can smell the water rising in the hull long before the captain admits the vessel is doomed. Day 8 at the estate, I met Ethan Pierce at a restaurant near Grand Central Terminal. Not the kind of place anyone from our old world would recognize us. Formica tables, weak coffee lunch specials, written on a chalkboard in marker that had seen better decades, anonymous and forgettable. Ethan looked thinner than when he'd met me at the prison gates. Shadows under his eyes tied. I loosened the polished veneer cracking around the edges. Thank you for coming, he said, gripping his coffee cup too tight. You said you had something I needed. He pulled a flash drive from his jacket pocket, set it on the table between us like evidence at a trial. I've been in the closed-door meetings. The fund is hemorrhaging. Vermont losses are worse than anyone knows. Julian is finished, he just doesn't know it yet. I picked up the flash drive. Small silver containing what exactly? Internal meeting schedules, Ethan said. Emails Julian deleted but the server retained copies of. Board member communications about the family council vote. Everything. What do you want? A letter of recommendation. For wherever I land next, I need my career to survive this. I could have negotiated. Could have made him sweat, lowered the price, extracted additional favors. But smart strategists know when to pay full price immediately because the asset is worth more than the cost. Done, I said. Ethan exhaled, relief flooding his face like a man who'd been holding his breath underwater. Then he said the thing that changed everything. I know you've been communicating with your lawyer. Encrypted messages, careful timing. I chose you because you're going to win. I froze. You've been monitoring my communications. Not monitoring, observing. I handle Julian's IT security. I see patterns, traffic analysis. You've been building something methodical, coordinated, professional. He leaned forward. I didn't come to you because I'm desperate. I came because I analyzed the game board, and you're the only one playing 10 moves ahead. Julian's playing checkers, you're playing chess. Loyalty in the corporate world lasts exactly as long as the paycheck's clear and the career trajectory points upward. The moment the ship lists, everyone grabs their own life raft and rows for shore. Ethan wasn't betraying Julian out of moral outrage or personal vendetta. He was switching sides because he'd done the math and calculated I had better odds of winning. Honest mercenaries are more valuable than false allies. November 15th, I said. Family council meeting. Be ready to move fast when it happens. Ethan nodded. I will. He left first. I stayed finishing the terrible coffee, looking at the flash drive that contained Julian's deleted sins preserved forever in server backups he'd forgotten existed. 2 days later, I sat in Jerome's law office for a strategic planning session that would determine how this war ended. 3 people around the desk. Charts and timelines covering every surface. The smell of Jerome's expensive coffee mixing with paper and leather. Dominic Rawlings, 45, the Manhattan Crisis Communications consultant, Jerome had recommended laid out his media timeline with surgical precision, 3 papers same day, 48 hours before the vote, zero chance of escape. Wall Street Journal, Financial Times, Bloomberg, Dominic said, tapping each name on his chart. Simultaneous publication, November 13th. I've cultivated contacts at all 3. Give them the story with documentation, insurance fraud, Dodd-Frank violations, offshore accounts, and they'll run it immediately. Financial journalism lives for scandals this clean. 48 hours before the family council votes, Jerome added. No time for Julian to hire a crisis team. No time to craft a response narrative. He walks into that November 15th meeting with the financial press destroying him in real time. And the Plaza Hotel, I asked. Sound system installation happens November 11th. Dominic said. 2 days before the press leak, Victoria's bathroom confession broadcast to 300 guests. Social humiliation first, then financial destruction. They'll remember the gala scandal when they read the fraud allegations, reinforcing narratives. Here's what Martha taught me about information warfare. You don't just leak the truth, you control when, where, and how it detonates. Timing isn't everything, it's the only thing. Release too early, and your enemy has time to spin, deny, distract. Release too late and the moment passes. But release at exactly the right moment and the explosion is amplified by every circumstance you've carefully arranged. November 11th Plaza Gala humiliation. November 13th financial press destruction. November 15th family council vote with Julian bleeding from every wound. 3 dominoes perfectly spaced time to fall in sequence. Coordinated assault, I said. Public and professional, personal and systemic, no avenue of escape. Dominic smiled. It wasn't warm. Your grandmother would have made an excellent crisis consultant. This is textbook information warfare. She taught me well. Jerome spread another document across the desk. Family council voting patterns Raymond had provided, 12 members total. Julian controlled 6 reliably. Raymond controlled 2. 4 were genuinely independent, and those 4 would decide everything. The independents won't vote for someone under federal investigation, Jerome said. Especially not with the press running daily scandal coverage. They'll cut Julian loose to protect their own reputations. And Raymond gets the CEO position, I added. Unless you have something better planned, Jerome said carefully. I did. But Raymond didn't know about it yet. Dominic rolled up the timeline chart, tucked it under his arm. Jerome walked him to the door, discussing technical details about file formats and source protection. I stayed at the desk, looking at the November calendar marked with red circles. 11, 13, 15, 3 dates that would destroy a man who thought he was untouchable. But I had one more card to play. One more piece of information that would transform Raymond from opportunistic ally into genuine weapon. Denise Frost had sent me a message yesterday, short, encrypted. Found Montana files, you need to see these. Montana. The investment deal that went wrong in 2021. The failure that cost Raymond his position on the family council. The conspiracy he'd suspected but never proven. I was about to hand him proof. And when I did, Raymond would stop being my temporary ceasefire partner and become my most motivated soldier. My grandmother used to say in war, the one who controls information controls the outcome. We were about to control both. Day 12, I played the Montana card that would transform Raymond from opportunistic ally into genuine weapon. The most dangerous enemies are the ones who started planning your destruction years before you even knew their name. Denise met me in the estate garden's secluded corner. Trees blocked the view from house windows. Fall air cut sharp and cold, smelling like dying leaves and approaching winter. She carried a new file folder, worn manila edges soft from handling. I found something, she said. From 2021, the Montana deal. I'd heard about Montana. Real estate partnership that went wrong, cost the company millions. Got Raymond blamed and removed from the family council. Ancient history by corporate standards. Except it wasn't history. It was murder weapon I hadn't known existed. Denise spread the documents on the garden bench. internal Vance Capital communications, email chains, financial projections, all dated 18 months ago. Victoria sent Julian fake financial projections, Denise said, pointing to highlighted sections. Claiming Raymond was backing out of the Montana partnership, Julian confronted Raymond based on lies. The deal collapsed. Raymond was voted off the council 3 months later. I read the emails, studied the dates. The pattern emerged like a photograph developing in chemical bath. Victoria hadn't just destroyed me. She'd been systematically removing Julian's family allies years before she ever faked a pregnancy. Raymond was the first obstacle she'd eliminated. She didn't just want to marry Julian, I said slowly. She wanted to own Vance Capital entirely. Raymond was the first piece she removed from the board. While you were still married, Denise added. Before the affair went public, before the trial, she was already planning how to control everything. Victoria started destroying Julian's family 3 years before I went to prison. While I was analyzing quarterly reports as his financial analyst wife, she was already plotting to own everything he'd built. I was blind. We all were. I pulled out my phone, called Raymond. The Montana deal in 2021, I said when he answered. Do you want to know who was really behind the collapse? There was a long silence, then, I'm listening. Not over the phone. Tomorrow. Jerome's office. Bring whatever appetite for revenge you've been nursing for 18 months. I hung up before he could respond. Denise gathered the documents carefully. She's been planning this longer than anyone knew, she said. Everyone plans, I replied. The question is who executes better. 3 days later evening, estate kitchen. Julian making coffee, personally attempting domestic normalcy he'd never had the skill set for. He'd been stressed lately. Fine lines deeper around his eyes. Shoulders tight with tension he couldn't fully hide. The council is fracturing, he said, measuring grounds with hands that weren't quite steady. 3 members are quietly siding with Raymond. They want explanations for Vermont before they vote on the November 15th expansion approval. I sat at the kitchen island, performing with my concerned wife. Which 3? Harrison, Whitfield, and Vance. He named the family council's most independent voices, the ones who actually asked questions instead of rubber-stamping decisions. They're asking for full accounting of Vermont losses. Raymond's been feeding them selective information. What did you tell them? The truth, that Vermont is a long-term strategic acquisition, losses are temporary. The November 15th vote will approve everything. He poured coffee into expensive mugs, hands steadier now that he was talking, confessing, unburdening himself to the only person he thought had no agenda except his well-being. You're the only person I can talk to about this, Julian said, sitting across from me. Everyone else has an agenda, everyone wants something, but you just want me to be okay. I reached across the table, took his hand, squeezed gently. Of course, I said. We're in this together. He squeezed back, gratitude in his eyes, trust so complete it was almost painful to witness. I catalogued everything. Harrison, Whitfield, Chen. 3 votes Raymond controlled. 3 votes that meant the November 15th decision was closer than anyone had calculated. Julian needed 7 votes to approve Vermont expansion. He thought he had 6 reliable, needed 1 more from the independents. But if Raymond had 3 and Julian had 6, that left 3 genuinely undecided. The entire empire balanced on 3 people who could go either way. You'll want to know the purest form of power. It's when your enemy trusts you so completely, they hand you the ammunition to destroy themselves and thank you for listening while they do it. Raymond's been more aggressive lately, Julian continued. Taking meetings with council members I haven't authorized, building coalitions. I think he's planning something for November 15th. Like what? A challenge, maybe a vote of no confidence. He wants the CEO position, always has. Montana destroyed his reputation but not his ambition. My grandmother used to say the smartest person in the room is the one who talks the least. I nodded. I smiled. I let him keep talking. He told me about financial projections he was preparing. Legal arguments his attorneys were crafting. Political favors he was calling in with council members who owed him. Every word was intelligence I'd feed directly to the coalition destroying him. What do you think I should do? He asked. I pretended to consider. Trust your instincts. You've built this company from nothing. The council knows that. They'll remember your track record when it matters. He smiled, relieved. You're right, thank you, I needed to hear that. We finished coffee. Talked about small things. Weather. The estate's heating system needing maintenance. Normal domestic conversation between a husband and wife who trusted each other. Except I felt absolutely nothing except satisfaction at information gathered. Julian walked me to my bedroom door later, kissed my forehead gently like I was something precious and fragile. "You're the only person I trust," he whispered. I closed the door, leaned against it, pulled out my phone. 3 new messages. Dominic, Plaza equipment installed, audio test successful, we're ready. Chloe, Geneva flight confirmed November 14, arriving JFK 6 a.m. Raymond, emergency meeting requested, Montana files, tomorrow morning. The final pieces were falling into position. November was half over. 15 days until the council vote. 15 days until everything I'd built in prison cells and basement rooms and kitchen conversations would detonate simultaneously. Julian thought I was his ally, his confidant, his last source of uncomplicated trust in a world turning hostile. I was wrong. I was the architect of that hostile world, and tomorrow I'd give Raymond the ammunition that would make him stop being opportunistic partner and become genuine soldier in the war Julian didn't know he'd already lost. The pieces were in position. Now I just needed to activate them in the right sequence. Sometimes justice finds its own messengers. People who testify not for money, but because they've seen the same monster destroy someone else and refuse to let it happen again. Day 17, late evening. I locked my bedroom door at the estate, drew curtains against November darkness, put on headphones, laptop glowing blue in the shadows. Video call to Geneva. Chloe Dupoint, 26, appeared on my screen from Geneva International Medical Center, precise, determined, and carrying the moral weight of a woman who'd watched Dr. Prescott's fraud kill someone and refused to let it happen again. "Thank you for calling," she said in accented English, French-Swiss educated professional. "I wanted to confirm personally before I fly." "November 14th, I said. "You're certain about voluntary testimony?" "I'm certain." No hesitation. "I'm not doing this for money. 3 years ago, Dr. Prescott signed a false medical assessment. A woman with stage 2 breast cancer. Insurance company denied her claim based on his certification. She went bankrupt paying for treatment out of pocket. 6 months later, she killed herself." The words landed like stones in still water. "I found the falsified document during a records audit last year," Chloe continued. "Cross-referenced his signatures against patient outcomes. The pattern was unmistakable, but I had no way to stop him until you contacted me about Victoria Sinclair's case." "This is personal for you," I said. "The woman's name was Claire Moreau. She had 2 daughters, 14 and 16. I met them at the funeral." Chloe's voice stayed steady, but something harder entered her eyes. "I've been waiting for someone to finally stop him. This is my chance. A woman died because Prescott signed a lie 3 years ago. She went bankrupt fighting cancer alone, and Chloe was flying across an ocean not for money, not for fame, just to make sure it never happened again. That's the kind of witness you can't discredit. That's the kind of testimony that ends careers." "I'll cover all travel expenses," I said. "Full legal protection. Jerome Kane will coordinate everything." "You don't need to thank me," Chloe said. "Just make sure he never signs another medical document as long as he lives." The call ended. I sat in darkness, laptop screen fading to black, thinking about Claire Moreau and her daughters. About all the people Victoria and Prescott had destroyed pursuing money they didn't need. This wasn't just revenge anymore, it was something larger. 3 days later, I sat across from Jerome in his law office. Contracts spread across the mahogany desk like evidence at a trial. "I wanted you to see this in person," Jerome said, sliding a document toward me. "Your prenuptial agreement, signed 5 years ago before you married Julian." I'd signed it. I remembered the ceremony. Martha's estate attorney present, Jerome as witness, Julian joking about how we'd never need it because we'd be together forever. 5 years felt like 5 lifetimes ago. "Section 7, paragraph 3, Jerome said, tapping the highlighted text. "Fidelity penalty provision." I read the clause carefully. Legal language dense and precise. But the meaning was crystal clear. Verifiable proof of spousal adultery triggers. Automatic transfer of all personal ownership shares in Vance Capital. Not company assets, not salary. Julian's controlling stake percentage, his actual power in the company he'd built. "Your grandmother had this inserted," Jerome said. "She told me at the time, wealth corrupts, love doesn't prevent it, but contracts can limit the damage." I looked up. "Martha predicted this. She predicted the possibility. She hoped it would never be necessary, but she built the failsafe anyway. Martha knew. 5 years before Victoria, before prison, before any of this. Martha looked at Julian's ambition and thought, I need insurance. She built a legal nuclear option into my marriage contract and never told me. That's not cynicism, that's love with clear eyes. How does activation work? I asked. File with Manhattan Family Court, November 13th, with photographic evidence of Julian and Victoria. The court issues automatic preliminary order freezing share transfer pending investigation. That locks Julian's ownership stake 48 hours before the family council can vote November 15th. He can't sell, can't transfer, can't use his shares as leverage. Exactly. The council votes on Vermont expansion and CEO confidence while Julian's power is legally frozen. He walks into that meeting functionally neutered. I traced the highlighted clause with my finger. Martha's handwriting in the margin, faded blue ink, insurance policy, use only if necessary. He signed it without reading carefully, Jerome said. I watched him. He trusted you. He trusted Martha. He thought family meant unconditional loyalty. That trust is about to cost him everything, I said. Jerome pulled another folder from his desk. Photographic evidence. Victoria entering Julian's private apartment in Tribeca. Dates, timestamps, building security footage Ethan provided. 3 years of documented affair. More than enough for family court preliminary order. I opened the folder. Photographs. Crisp, clear, undeniable. Victoria and Julian. Entering buildings together. Leaving hotels. Evidence that would have destroyed my marriage 3 years ago if I'd seen it then. Now it was just ammunition. November 13th, I said. 2 days before the council vote. Same day Dominic leaks to the press. Coordinated assault, legal, financial, personal, no escape routes. I closed the folder. Looked at the prenuptial agreement with its yellow highlights and Martha's careful handwriting. For the first time since walking out of prison, I smiled. A real smile. Not performance, not strategy. Just pure satisfaction at knowing my grandmother had armed me for this war before I even knew I'd need to fight it. She'd loved me enough to build weapons I might never use. She'd been wise enough to know I probably would. November 13th, I repeated. We file everything, press leaks, court orders. Then we wait for November 15th and watch him try to hold power while bleeding from every wound we've opened. Jerome gathered the documents carefully. Your grandmother would be proud. She'd probably tell me I was being too gentle, I said. Jerome actually laughed. Probably. I left his office carrying copies of everything. Prenuptial agreement. Photographic evidence. Timeline. The weapons Martha had built and I was about to deploy. 9 days until November 13th. 9 days until Julian discovered the woman sleeping down the hall from him, the broken, traumatized wife he pitied and protected, was actually the general who'd been planning his destruction from a prison cell. 9 days until the insurance policy came due. 9 days became 8. The weapons were assembled. Now I just needed to maintain perfect boundaries until deployment. The most powerful thing you can do to someone who hurt you isn't destruction. It's maintaining perfect boundaries while they beg for connection they no longer deserve. Night of day 22. Estate hallway, lit by a single dim nightlight. Complete silence, except footsteps approaching my bedroom door. Julian knocked, soft, hesitant, not drunk, not aggressive, just wanting something I couldn't give him anymore. I opened the door 6 inches, bodies separated by threshold conversation through the gap. Can we talk? He asked. Shadows under his eyes shirt untucked, the polished veneer cracking. Just sit and talk. I haven't been able to sleep since I saw your back. The scars, the cigarette burns, the evidence of what his choices had cost me in concrete and steel and violence. It's late, I said. I know. He ran his hand through his hair. Gesture I'd seen 1,000 times when he was struggling with something he couldn't name. I've been going through old emails, Victoria's communications, 3 years back. I need to know what I missed, what I refused to see. There it was. Twist 9 paying off exactly as I'd orchestrated. The guilt from seeing my scars driving him to investigate the woman he'd chosen over me. Not because I asked, not because Jerome suggested it, because his own conscience, that small piece of him that still remembered being a decent person, couldn't ignore the evidence anymore. And what are you finding? I asked. Inconsistencies. Lies about small things that make me question everything else. His voice dropped. I should have looked sooner. I should have believed you when. Good night, Julian, I said gently. We both need sleep. I closed the door. No slam, no trembling, just a soft click of the latch engaging. Leaned against it in darkness, listening to his footsteps retreat down the hallway. Slow, heavy, the sound of a man carrying weight he'd only just realized existed. I pulled out my phone, checked the calendar. 8 days until November 13th, prenup filing. 10 days until November 15th, council vote. I stood leaning against that door for a long time in the darkness. Only one number ran through my head: 8 days. 8 days until the prenuptial filing. 8 days until he discovers what good night really meant. 3 days later, I sat in Jerome's office while he spread new intelligence across his desk. I studied the numbers, the routing, the dates. Julian had hidden money overseas to avoid U.S. tax reporting, accepted kickbacks from developers, violated federal law. So blatantly, it was almost insulting to assume no one would ever check. What are the consequences? I asked. We turn this over to the SEC. He faces federal prosecution. 5 to 7 years minimum. Mandatory sentencing guidelines. White-collar prison but still prison. 5 to 7 years. What I'd served times 3. Justice in the purest mathematical sense, he'd suffer proportionally to the harm he'd caused, locked away from freedom and choice and the empire he'd built through crime. I sat silent for a very long time. Thought about Martha. About the Vermont fund she'd built cleanly, ethically, without a single violation. About her voice teaching me at 22 that winning meant nothing if you became the monster you were fighting. Thought about Victoria. About how she'd wanted me destroyed, completely erased, made to suffer until there was nothing left. Thought about who I wanted to be when this war ended. Here's the thing about vengeance versus justice. Vengeance wants the enemy destroyed, completely erased, made to suffer, until there's nothing left. Justice just wants balance restored. Martha taught me that. And I was her granddaughter, not Victoria's mirror image. No, I said finally. Jerome looked up. No, no jail. I don't want him to go to prison. I met his eyes. I want him to live to watch everything he built crumble piece by piece every single day. That's the real punishment. Not bars, not isolation. Just the slow realization that the empire he destroyed a marriage for, that he sent me to prison for, that he violated federal law for, it's all gone anyway. And he has to wake up every morning and live with what he traded it all for. Jerome studied me. Something shifted in his expression. Respect, maybe. Or recognition that I'd drawn a line Victoria never would have. We don't play by his rules, I added quietly. We play by my grandmother's rules, clean, legal, final. No revenge that requires me to become what I'm fighting against. The prenup filing is enough, Jerome said. Combined with the press leaks, the council vote, the insurance fraud exposure. He loses everything that matters: power, reputation, control, without us crossing into vengeance territory. Exactly. Jerome gathered the offshore documents carefully, filed them away. Evidence of crimes we'd never prosecute because I'd decided there were boundaries even revenge couldn't cross. Your grandmother would be proud, he said. I thought about that. About Martha watching from whatever place the dead occupy, seeing her granddaughter choose justice over destruction. Tomorrow I received the Vermont Fund's full valuation report, I said. The final accounting of what she built to protect me. 8 days from now, Julian discovers what she prepared. I want to be ready. Jerome walked me to the door, put his hand on my shoulder. Not lawyer to client, friend to friend. You are ready, he said. I looked back at his desk. At the offshore documents still visible in their folder. At the evidence of Julian's crimes we'd never use because I'd chosen to win without becoming the thing I was destroying. Martha had armed me for war, but she'd also taught me when not to fire every weapon I carried. That was the real inheritance. Not the money, not the legal clauses. The wisdom to know the difference between justice and vengeance. And I was choosing justice. Even if it meant Julian never spent a single day behind the bars that had held me for 730 days. Even if it meant he'd walk free while I'd walked broken. Because freedom wasn't measured in who went to prison. It was measured in who you chose to become when you had the power to destroy. And I chose to be Martha's granddaughter, not Victoria's equal. I'd chosen justice over vengeance, preservation over destruction. The next morning I learned exactly what Martha had preserved for me to fight with. $47 million. The exact price Martha placed on my freedom, built, brick by brick, while I slept on concrete floors, and she died alone, believing I'd survive. Day 28. Early morning. Express mail envelope waited on my bedroom desk. Morning light streaming through estate windows, turning everything gold. Vermont Fund Manager's official valuation report. Thick packet professional binding numbers that made my hands shake. Current portfolio valuation $47 million. Growth rate 214% over 24 months. All investments structured as eco-friendly real estate across Green Mountains region. Conservation easements, sustainable development partnerships, the kind of patient wealth building Martha had pioneered decades ago when everyone else chased quick returns. I read every page sitting on the bed edge. Real estate holdings, partnership agreements, revenue projections. Martha had taken $15 million, her life savings, the money she'd protected through widowhood and market crashes, and every crisis that came and tripled it while I was locked away. Irrevocable trust structure. Legal language I'd learned to read in prison law library during the hours when I wasn't planning revenge. Irrevocable trust structure ensures principal and earnings remain protected regardless of civil litigation, divorce proceedings, or creditor claims against beneficiary's spouse. Julian couldn't touch a single dollar. Not through lawyers, not through courts, not through the Vermont acquisition he thought would give him leverage. Martha had built walls around this money that no legal attack could breach. Then I found the note. Handwritten, blue ink fading slightly. Martha's precise script that I'd seen on birthday cards and grocery lists, and the deed to her Vermont cabin, dated 3 months before her death. If you're reading this, my darling, I'm not there anymore. But every dollar in this fund was built to catch you when you fell. You were never alone. I managed these investments from hospice. The nurses thought I was writing letters, but I was reviewing quarterly reports and rebalancing portfolios. Wealth without purpose is just numbers. This wealth has one purpose: protecting you when I cannot. The fund manager has contingency instructions if you remained imprisoned longer. If appeal failed. If parole was denied. I planned for every scenario except the one where you give up. Don't give up. You're stronger than they know. You're my granddaughter. Martha. I sat on that bed holding Martha's handwritten note, tears falling onto the paper, and understood something I'd never fully grasped before. Love isn't just what people say or feel, it's what they build to protect you when they know they won't be there anymore. She'd fought for me from a hospice bed, managed millions while dying, built financial fortresses while her body failed. Not because she thought I was weak, because she knew I was strong enough to use what she gave me to survive. I cried, not from pain, not from trauma, from overwhelming gratitude that Martha had been fighting for my freedom even while dying alone, because visiting hours didn't apply to inmates in maximum security. First tears since prison that weren't about what I'd lost. These were about what I'd been given. 2 days later, reality crashed back. Day 30, afternoon. Encrypted message from Ethan. I opened it in my bedroom door, locked, curtains drawn. Julian requested full email archive pull. Victoria Sinclair, 3 years back. Every message including server backups of deleted items. IT estimates 40,000 individual communications. He's been in his office until midnight every night, alone. Won't talk to anyone, just reads emails with his door locked. 40,000 emails. 3 years. Julian was about to read every lie Victoria told, every manipulation she deployed, every step of her plan to destroy his family and steal his empire. And he was doing it because I let him see my scars. Twist 9, paying off, exactly as calculated. The guilt-driving independent investigation. The psychological manipulation working better than I'd planned, because the trauma it exploited was absolutely real. I texted Ethan back, timeline coverage. Response came in seconds. First email dated October 2019. Victoria's initial contact. Goes through last week. Complete archive. October 2019. 3.5 years ago. Before the affair went public. Before the pregnancy claim. Before any of us knew Victoria existed as anything more than a charity event organizer who smiled at Julian across crowded ballrooms. I was questioning the foundation. Not just recent lies, the entire relationship. I checked my calendar. November 8th, 5 days until November 13th, prenup filing. 7 days until November 15th, family council vote. The countdown was accelerating. Every piece falling into position. Julian investigating Victoria. Raymond armed with Montana conspiracy proof. Dominic ready to leak to the press. Chloe flying from Geneva with testimony that would destroy Dr. Prescott. And Martha's $47 million sitting untouchable in Vermont, protecting me from every legal attack Julian could mount, even if he somehow survived what was coming. I stood at the window, watching November rain fall on perfectly manicured Greenwich lawns, estate grounds that cost more to maintain each month than most people earned in a year. Wealth built on crimes Julian thought were invisible. My phone buzzed. Text from Jerome. Need to talk. Tomorrow. Important. I texted back, what about? Long pause. Then, employee retirement accounts. It's worse than we thought. Much worse. Something cold settled in my stomach. The Vermont fund was personal. My land, my grandmother's legacy, my freedom. But employee retirement accounts. That was different. That was working people's futures. Families counting on money they'd earned. The systematic theft I'd seen in Julian's emails was bigger than I'd calculated. I looked at Ethan's message again. Julian locked in his office reading Victoria's emails, obsessively searching for truth he'd refused to see. And tomorrow Jerome would tell me something that would change everything. Make me question whether my revenge had just become something far bigger than personal justice. 7 days until the council vote, 5 days until the prenuptial filing locked Julian's shares, and suddenly I realized this wasn't just about Martha anymore. It wasn't just about the 2 years I'd lost or the scars on my back or the Vermont land Julian was stealing. This was about 340 families whose retirement accounts Julian had raided to cover his gambling losses on land acquisition. Personal revenge was transforming into something larger, and I wasn't sure I was ready for what that meant. Day 32, Jerome's call transformed personal revenge into something I couldn't ignore. The coffee had gone cold in my cup. I'd poured it an hour ago before Jerome's text, need to call, big. Now the surface showed an oily film and my reflection stared back distorted waiting. I was in the estate's home office, Julian at his Manhattan tower, me alone with documents and silence. The phone rang. I found something in the employee retirement records, Jerome said without greeting. His voice carried a weight I hadn't heard before. It's worse than the Dodd-Frank violations, much worse. Tell me. Julian didn't just divert funds to cover Vermont losses. He systematically drained employee retirement accounts. 340 employees. $12 million total. Over 3 years. The numbers hit me like physical blows. 340 employees. Not abstract investors. Not wealthy board members. Working people. Analysts. Assistants. IT staff. People who'd spent careers building nest eggs, trusting their employer to protect what they'd earned. How long has he been doing this? I asked. Started small 3 years ago. A few $100,000 here and there. Escalated as Vermont losses mounted. The latest transfer was 6 weeks ago. $2 million moved from the employee pension fund to cover margin calls on land acquisition that was already failing. I thought about my own 2 years in prison. 730 days. While I was locked away, Julian was stealing from 340 families. Retirement accounts. The money people counted on for healthcare for their children's education for the years when their bodies couldn't work anymore. Do they know? I asked. Not yet. The pension fund reports to employees quarterly. Next report goes out December 1st. If we don't act before then, 340 families open their statements and discover their futures were gambled away to buy land Julian couldn't afford. Outside my window, a cardinal landed on the bare oak branch. Its red feathers blazed against November gray. It cocked its head watching me through the glass with one black eye, then flew away. I'd started this for Martha. For the Vermont land she'd protected. For the 2 years of my life Julian had stolen through his mistress's lies. But this wasn't about me anymore. This was about 340 people who'd done nothing except trust their employer. Who'd worked late nights and weekends. Who'd sacrificed immediate income for future security. Who'd played by every rule and still got destroyed by someone who thought rules were suggestions. What's the legal exposure? I asked. Federal, ERISA violations, Employee Retirement Income Security Act, fiduciary breach. If prosecuted, he's looking at significant prison time plus mandatory restitution. But here's the problem. The employees don't have time to wait for federal prosecution, I finished. They need their money back now. Exactly. Legal process takes years. Meanwhile, people approaching retirement have nothing. I sat in that office looking at documents spread across my desk. Evidence of Julian's crimes, Martha's fund valuation, the prenuptial agreement that would transfer his shares, Raymond's upcoming intelligence about Vermont Council corruption. Everything I'd built was personal. Martha's legacy, my imprisonment, the scars on my back. But suddenly personal wasn't enough. The prenup filing, I said. When it transfers Julian's shares to me, what happens to his obligation to restore the pension fund? You'd inherit the legal obligation along with the assets. The transferred shares would be subject to employee claims. You could sell them to fund immediate restitution. How much are his shares worth? Current market value, approximately 18 million. More than enough to restore the 12 million stolen plus damages. I did the math. Take Julian's shares through prenup enforcement. Sell them immediately. Restore every dollar to the retirement accounts. 340 families made whole. And I'd walk away with nothing except the satisfaction that Martha's granddaughter chose justice over wealth. Jerome, I said quietly, when this is over, I want those employees made whole. Every dollar. I don't care what it costs me. There was a long pause. Then, your grandmother would be proud. My grandmother taught me that wealth without purpose is just numbers. This has purpose. Before I tell you what Raymond's evidence revealed about Victoria's conspiracy, comment A if you think I should expose her publicly, or B if I should use this as private leverage. Add one short reason why in your own words. Quick note. The next part includes some fictionalized details added to deepen the emotional impact and convey the core message. An hour later, Raymond showed up unannounced at the estate's front door. I opened it to find him, standing in November twilight. Expensive coat briefcase. The look of a man delivering ammunition. We need to talk, he said. I let him in. Led him to the study. Closed the door. He spread documents across the desk. 43 pages, financial records, email communications, payment receipts. Victoria's family, Raymond said, pointing to highlighted sections. They've been lobbying Vermont council members against Martha's ecological fund approval. Payment records go back 18 months. I studied the documents. Names, dates, dollar amounts transferred from offshore accounts to council members' family businesses. The conspiracy I'd suspected was real and documented. How did you get this? I asked. Montana connections. People who owe me favors. People who want Victoria's family humiliated as much as I do. Raymond's smile was cold. This is my final card. The intelligence that ends her influence permanently. I looked at the evidence. Proof that Victoria's family had been systematically sabotaging Martha's legacy, bribing council members, ensuring the vote would fail. Not just theft, conspiracy. What do you want in return? I asked. Raymond met my eyes. CEO position. After Julian falls, after the November 15th vote, you use this evidence to destroy Victoria's credibility. I take the chair. We both get what we want. Transactional, always transactional. But the evidence was real. And 43 pages of documented corruption was a weapon I couldn't refuse. I'll use it, I said. Raymond stood. Then we have a deal. He left the documents, walked out without another word. I sat alone with the evidence. 43 pages detailing how Victoria's family had tried to destroy Martha's life work. 4 days until November 13th, prenup filing. 6 days until November 15th, council vote. And tomorrow I'd have to decide expose Victoria publicly and risk revealing my alliance with Raymond, or use the intelligence as private leverage and let her think she's safe until it's too late. The weapon was loaded. Now I just needed to aim. I decided on private leverage. But the perfect moment arrived faster than I'd calculated. Ethan's text arrived at dawn. He has the Geneva footage. Julian. Geneva surveillance records. The proof I'd sent anonymously weeks ago, Victoria's medical history showing the hysterectomy that made pregnancy impossible. He'd finally looked. Ethan's follow-up, going to her apartment now, thought you should know. I sat watching November sunrise, knowing miles away. Julian was about to confront Victoria with evidence of her lies. The guilt from my scars had driven him to investigate. Now investigation was forcing confrontation. Exactly as I'd orchestrated without speaking a word. Hours later, Ethan sent reports. He showed her the records, Geneva International, the hysterectomy documentation, medical impossibility of pregnancy. Ethan had positioned himself across from Victoria's Soho apartment, watching through windows, reporting like a war correspondent. She's crying, he's standing, just holding the papers. She's talking, explaining, justifying. I imagined Victoria's performance. The tears designed to manipulate. Every tool she'd used to send me to prison now deployed to save herself. But Julian had seen my scars. had read her emails, had discovered lies everywhere. Victoria laughed, actually laughed. Ethan, she just laughed, said something, he's not responding. I could almost hear it. The contempt. Victoria thinking she could charm her way out of documented medical fraud. He's leaving, didn't say anything, just walked out. She's calling after him. Silence. I waited, checked my phone, wondering if Julian would come home, confront me, ask questions I'd been waiting to answer. I didn't. Ethan's final message arrived at 3:30 a.m. He's at the office, been sitting at his desk since 11 p.m., hasn't moved, just staring at the wall. The alliance was shattered. Victoria and Julian's partnership, built on lies, sustained by mutual benefit, protected by shared secrets, had cracked under evidence I'd placed in Julian's hands through anonymous mail and strategic trauma display. Twist 9 complete. Psychological manipulation had worked better than planned. Next evening I stood in my dressing room preparing for the Plaza Gala. Midnight blue silk gown hanging on the door. Simple, elegant, wealth that whispered instead of shouted. Martha had taught me that. I pulled out my phone, opened the audio app Dominic installed, tested the connection. Bluetooth signal stable. Range 80 feet. Linked to Plaza Hotel bathroom sound system. Dominic's team integrated during yesterday's routine maintenance. Connection stable, I whispered. Audio files queued. Victoria confirmed. Her RSVP arrived this morning. Attending with Julian Ashford, 7 p.m. arrival. She was coming. Elite Society Charity Gala, 300 donors opportunity, to prove she hadn't been broken. Victoria would walk into that bathroom thinking she was safe. Thinking Julian's silence meant acceptance or resignation. Wrong. I reviewed timing. Gala at 7. Cocktail hour until 8. Dinner 8:30. Victoria would need the bathroom around 9. 3 glasses of champagne made people predictable. Dominic had tested microphone placement. Perfect acoustics. Every word would broadcast to 300 people eating overpriced chicken and pretending to care about charity. My hands were steady. When did that happen? Somewhere between prison gate and this dressing room, I'd stopped shaking. Stopped being the broken woman who vomited at meat smells and slept on floors. Started being something else. Martha trained me for numbers, I said to my reflection. She made me someone who could do this. Martha had taught me financial analysis, portfolio management, risk assessment, clinical precision to build wealth without emotion clouding judgment. But also something deeper. How to separate personal pain from strategic necessity. How to use authentic trauma as cover for calculated moves. How to be the person nobody suspected because they pitied the victim too much to notice the general. November 9th, 4 days until November 13th, prenup filing. 6 days until November 15th, council vote. Every piece falling into position. Julian and Victoria's alliance shattered. Raymond armed with Montana conspiracy proof expecting CEO position. Chloe flying from Geneva to testify against Dr. Prescott. Dominic ready to leak to 3 major publications simultaneously. Jerome holding the prenuptial agreement that would transfer Julian's shares. And tomorrow night, 300 elite New Yorkers would hear Victoria confess to crimes she didn't know were being recorded. I looked at myself in the mirror. 30 years old, 2 years stolen, scars on my back, floor sleeping habits I couldn't break, PTSD that made dinners into nightmares. But also, Martha's granddaughter, forensic accountant, strategic planner, the woman who'd built an army from a prison cell using intelligence, patience, and willingness to weaponize her own trauma. The person Martha trained is finally free, I said. Not free from Julian, not free from prison, not free from scars, free to execute what needed executing, free to be the weapon Martha had forged through decades of teaching, free to stop being victim and become architect of justice. I picked up the gown. Silk whispered against my hands. Expensive, beautiful. The dress that said I belong here, I'm harmless. Perfect camouflage. The gown hung on the door, midnight blue silk catching lamplight. Audio files queued on my phone. Victoria's RSVP on my desk attending with Julian Ashford 7 p.m. arrival. In 18 hours 300 people would hear everything. Every lie, every manipulation, every crime. I closed the laptop. Checked connection one final time. Perfect signal. Perfect placement. Perfect trap. Tomorrow Victoria walked into a bathroom thinking she was safe. Tomorrow the world discovered what happened when you destroyed the wrong person's family. I turned off the light, stood in darkness, felt nothing except cold certainty that every calculation had been correct, every move precise, every weapon loaded exactly as Martha would have wanted. The Plaza Gala would force every secret into the light, and I'd be standing there wearing midnight blue silk, watching 300 faces react in real time to the sound of Victoria's voice condemning herself with her own words. Justice didn't need to be loud. It just needed to be inevitable. 18 hours later, the trap was live. The plaza chandeliers threw 1,000 fractured reflections across 300 faces that turned to watch us enter. Julian beside me, midnight blue silk gown catching light with every step. His hand at the small of my back, protective, possessive. The gesture of a husband who thought he was supporting his fragile wife through her first public appearance since prison. He had no idea he was walking me to an execution. The grand ballroom smelled like expensive perfume and older money. Crystal, gold leaf, the kind of wealth that didn't need to prove anything because it had been proving itself for generations. "You look pale," Julian whispered. "Are you feeling well?" "Just nerves," I said. "Big crowd." He squeezed my hand. Reassurance. His guilt over my scars had made him tender in ways he'd never been before prison. Every kindness was another knife I'd planted in his back without him knowing. I pulled out my phone, checked the app. Victoria's location beacon pulsed green on my screen phone, connected to Plaza Wi-Fi tracker active exactly where Dominic said she'd be. "Victoria's here," I said quietly. "Gold dress, northeast corner." Julian's jaw tightened. He hadn't spoken to her since the Geneva confrontation, hadn't returned her calls, but he'd still come to this gala because backing out would have looked like weakness. I spotted her across the ballroom. Gold dress, perfect hair, arrogant smile. Talking to 3 council members whose names I recognized from Raymond's intelligence, the ones she'd been lobbying against Martha's fund. I could hear my grandmother's voice, precision not passion. Martha had taught me that revenge wasn't about emotion. It was about timing, patience, the willingness to wait for exactly the right moment when every variable aligned and the target had nowhere to run. That moment was 45 minutes away. We moved through the crowd. Handshakes, polite conversation, people asking how I was recovering, their eyes scanning my body for visible damage, disappointed when they found none. I smiled, nodded, played the role of the resilient wife who'd survived injustice with grace. Perfect camouflage. At 8 o'clock I excused myself, told Julian I needed the restroom. He offered to wait for me. I insisted he stay network, do what he came here to do. He kissed my forehead. "Take your time." I walked toward the restroom, phone in my hand, heart rate steady, no trembling, no fear, just cold calculation that Martha would have recognized immediately. The Plaza women's restroom was marble and mirrors, empty. I stood at the sink waiting. Footsteps in the hallway. The door opened. Victoria. She saw me and stopped. For a second I thought she'd leave, but arrogance won. It always did with people like her. "Well," she said, closing the door behind her, "look who finally crawled out of her hole." I said nothing, just looked at her, held my phone. "Your mother's precious fund will never be approved," Victoria continued, stepping closer. "I made sure of it. Council votes in 6 days. They'll reject it. Everything Martha worked for gone. And you'll watch it happen just like you watched everything else disappear." I stayed silent. She wanted a reaction. I gave her nothing. "You think Julian feels guilty?" Victoria laughed. Actually laughed. "He's weak. He saw your scars and decided you were some tragic victim he needed to save. But he'll come back to me. He always does. Because I give him what you never could, power connections, the kind of alliance that builds empires." She moved closer, close enough I could smell her perfume, expensive, cloying. "You'll rot in prison forever for what you tried," she hissed. "And I'll be there watching." I pressed connect. The speakers clicked on. Connection established. Victoria's voice broadcasting through the ballroom sound system. Dominic's team had integrated during yesterday's maintenance. Every word she'd just spoken, every threat, every confession, every arrogant declaration, transmitted in crystal clarity to 300 people eating dinner 30 feet away. "Every word," I said quietly. 300 people just heard every word. Victoria's face went white. She looked at my phone, at the green light showing active broadcast, at my face showing absolutely nothing except cold satisfaction. What did you— Precision, I said. Not passion, Martha taught me that. I walked out, left her standing there in marble and mirrors, finally understanding what happened when you destroyed the wrong person's family. The ballroom had gone completely silent, 300 faces staring at speakers, at each other, at Victoria emerging from the restroom with her perfect hair and gold dress, and the look of someone who'd just realized the trap had already closed. Julian found me at the entrance. What happened, everyone's— Let's go home, I said. We drove back to Greenwich in complete silence. Julian staring out the window. Me watching streetlights pass. Neither of us speaking, because there was nothing left to say that wouldn't make everything worse. Next morning, Dominic activated the media plan. 6 a.m., 3 text messages arriving simultaneously. Financial Times, Wall Street Journal, Bloomberg, all 3 published at 6 a.m., Dominic reported. Insurance fraud, medical falsification, corporate conspiracy, Victoria's name in every headline, complete coverage. I sat in the estate kitchen drinking coffee and reading the articles on my phone. Each one detailed Victoria's fraud with surgical precision, Dr. Prescott's involvement, the Geneva medical records, the insurance payout, the systematic lies. Dominic's sources had done their work perfectly. It's done, I texted back. She can't survive this. By noon, Victoria's law firm issued a statement denying everything. But her firm had already put her on administrative leave, damage control, distanced themselves before the scandal spread. The headlines wouldn't stop. Morning news, afternoon analysis, evening commentary. Victoria's face on every screen, her name in every conversation. Private revenge had become public destruction. Ethan's final message arrived at 2 p.m. He's been in his office since dawn, hasn't spoken to anyone. Door closed, phone off. Julian, alone in his corner office. No Victoria to call, no allies willing to associate with the scandal. No plan except sitting in silence with the ruins of everything he'd built on lies and theft and betrayal. For the first time in 20 years, he was completely alone with what he'd done. I stood at the estate window watching November rain. Phone showing Dominic's confirmation that the media cycle was unstoppable. Ethan's report that Julian had isolated himself completely. The Vermont Council vote was 72 hours away. Victoria was destroyed. Julian was broken. Raymond was positioned for CEO. And Martha's fund, the $47 million she'd built to protect me, would finally get its vote free from Victoria's sabotage and Julian's interference. I'd executed everything exactly as planned, so why did victory feel so hollow? Jerome's call came at 6 a.m. The doctor is ready to talk. I sat up in bed, heart pounding. The city outside my window was still dark, the streets below empty except for early delivery trucks. When, today, 2 p.m., Federal Building downtown, he's bringing everything: original records, the forgery timeline, Victoria's payment receipts, every piece of evidence we need. Dr. Neil Prescott was 58, a family medicine physician who'd maintained a small practice in Stamford for 23 years. He was the man who'd forged my medical records to make it appear I'd suffered no harm from the fire. Victoria orchestrated the documentation that allowed her insurance claim to deny my countersuit and pocket $375,000. Now he was ready to confess. What changed his mind? I asked. Victoria stopped paying him. She's been giving him $20,000 every quarter for 3 years. Last payment bounced 2 weeks ago. He called her attorney, got told she's cutting non-essential expenses. Non-essential. The word hung in the air like poison. He's willing to testify. More than testify. He wants full immunity. He's been documenting everything since the Plaza incident. Says he can't sleep, can't look at his daughter without seeing what he helped Victoria do to you. The guilt is eating him alive. I closed my eyes. Guilt was the lever I'd been waiting for. The confession took 47 minutes. Dr. Prescott sat across from Assistant U.S. Attorney Margaret Hollis and 2 FBI agents, his hands shaking as he walked them through every forged diagnosis, every falsified treatment note, every backdated entry that painted me as a woman who'd walked away from Victoria's fire unharmed. His voice cracked twice. He asked for water 3 times. She paid me $250,000 over 3 years, he said, voice barely above a whisper. I knew it was wrong from the beginning. I knew. But my practice was failing, and she made it sound like you were the villain, like you'd stolen from her family and deserved what happened. She was very convincing. Margaret Hollis's expression never changed. You understand this constitutes insurance fraud, conspiracy, and obstruction of justice. Yes. And you're willing to testify against Victoria Ashford Kent in exchange for immunity. Yes, I'll testify against anyone involved. I just want this to end. But here's what Dr. Prescott didn't know when he walked into that conference room the moment his confession included payment receipts and contemporaneous documentation. The case automatically transferred from civil to criminal court. Insurance fraud over $250,000 carries a federal mandatory minimum of 5 years. Victoria wasn't just facing a lawsuit anymore. She was facing federal prison. The transfer happened 48 hours before the Vermont Council vote. Raymond called at midnight. It's done. Criminal charges officially filed. U.S. Attorney's Office issued a statement an hour ago. They're calling it systematic insurance fraud with aggravating factors. How's she responding? Radio silence from Victoria herself. Her attorneys released a one-sentence denial. Julian hasn't commented publicly. The Vermont Council received official notice that Victoria Ashford Kent is under active federal criminal investigation. The timing couldn't be better. I sat in the dark watching the city lights blur through my window. One floor down, one floor complete. The second blow landed 36 hours later. Professor Arthur Sinclair was Victoria's father, 71 years old, holder of Columbia University's endowed chair in economic policy, a prestigious position he'd maintained for 19 years. He was the family's intellectual cornerstone, the man whose reputation had opened every door for Victoria her entire life. His name carried weight in academic circles and policy forums, in the rooms where power and influence intersected. That reputation died on a Tuesday morning. The Columbia investigation triggered by evidence Raymond had quietly provided to the university's Office of Research Integrity 3 weeks earlier, revealed that Professor Sinclair had systematically misused discretionary research funds to cover Victoria's personal debts. $730,000 over 8 years documented in budget transfers that coincided exactly with Victoria's margin calls, legal settlements, and private loans. The pattern was undeniable. The university's statement was clinical. Professor Arthur Sinclair has been relieved of his endowed chair and all teaching responsibilities effective immediately. Columbia University maintains zero tolerance for misuse of research funds. But the damage extended far beyond Columbia's campus. Within 6 hours, Princeton rescinded the honorary doctorate they'd awarded him in 2019. The American Economic Association suspended his fellowship pending further investigation. The Manhattan Institute removed his name from their quarterly policy journal. 20 years of academic prestige evaporated in a single news cycle. Victoria's father, the man who'd taught her that power and prestige mattered more than integrity, watched his life's work collapse while the world looked on. I received the final update at 9 p.m. Jerome's text was brief. Arthur Sinclair admitted to Columbia investigators that Victoria pressured him for years, said she threatened to expose his affair with a graduate student if he didn't help her financially. His marriage is over, his career is finished, his daughter destroyed him. I stood in my apartment looking at the 4-story tower I'd sketched weeks ago on a piece of paper that now sat framed on my desk. 2 floors were now complete. Floor 1, Victoria's social circle destroyed her philanthropic reputation, shattered her inner circle, turned against her. Floor 2, her professional network, dismantled criminal charges, filed her father's academic legacy, ruined her family's systematic corruption, exposed for everyone to see. 2 floors remained. Floor 3, Julian's financial empire, the billion-dollar foundation he'd built on fraud and my stolen inheritance. Floor 4, the Vermont Council, November 15th, the $47 million fund that should have been mine, the final vote that would determine whether my parents' legacy returned to their daughter or remained in the hands of the people who'd stolen everything. I picked up my phone and called Raymond. It's time, I said. Floor 3. Are you sure Julian won't fold like Victoria? He'll fight back hard. I'm counting on it. Floor 3 meant dismantling Julian's financial empire, but it didn't mean abandoning what remained of my integrity. I'd spent half a year letting him face the raw, unvarnished truth of my trauma, letting his own mounting guilt erode his confidence during critical business decisions. Tonight the pasta was just pasta, the wine was just wine. No performances left to give. He arrived at the Greenwich estate at 7:30, surprised to find me in the kitchen. We hadn't shared a meal in weeks, not since the Plaza incident, when Victoria's confession broadcast to 300 guests. "You cooked," he said, hanging his coat in the hallway. "I did." He sat across from me at the kitchen table, the same one where we'd eaten breakfast the morning after our wedding, where I'd once believed we might build something real. The pasta was simple aglio e olio, the way my mother used to make it. No manipulation, no hidden agenda. Just a final meal between two people who'd destroyed each other. He ate slowly, watching me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Suspicion, maybe, or exhaustion. He didn't know this was the last normal thing I'd ever give him. We finished in silence. He helped me clear the plates, a small gesture that felt enormous, given everything between us. Then I led him to the study and placed a 47-page document on his desk. "This is everything," I said. "Dodd-Frank violations, the Cayman accounts, all 12 million from the employees' retirement fund." His face went pale. He flipped through the first few pages, then stopped. "Where did you get this?" "Raymond, forensic accountants, 3 months of documentation. Every wire transfer, every shell company, every falsified audit report you filed with the SEC." He closed the folder. "What do you want?" 24 hours to file with the SEC yourself, or I do it for you. You're giving me a choice. I'm giving you what you never gave my mother, a choice." He stood there, hands still on the folder, looking at me like he was seeing me for the first time. "And if I file, the investigation proceeds either way. Criminal charges probably, but you get to control the narrative. You get to walk in yourself instead of being dragged in. That's not mercy." "No," I said, "it's dignity, more than you deserve." He picked up the folder. 24 hours. 24 hours. I left him standing in the study, walked out of the estate, and didn't look back. The family council convened at 10 a.m. on November 15th in the Vance Capital boardroom. Julian sat at one end of the long mahogany table, Raymond at the other. 5 board members filled the seats between them, 3 family trustees and 2 external advisors who'd served the Ashford-Vance partnership for 20 years. I watched from the gallery, separated by a glass partition that let me see but not participate. Raymond opened the presentation without preamble. "Vance Capital has been operating in violation of federal securities law for 6 years. The evidence is irrefutable." He walked them through it. The Dodd-Frank violations that should have triggered mandatory disclosure, the Cayman accounts that sheltered 12 million in stolen employee retirement funds, the falsified audit reports submitted quarterly to the SEC, the insurance fraud connection through Victoria that implicated Julian in conspiracy. The board members listened in silence. One woman, Margaret Vance, 73, family matriarch and largest non-Ashford shareholder, took notes in a leather journal. The others just stared. The prenuptial agreement between Julian Ashford and Callum Mercer contained a fraud clause. Raymond continued. "Upon discovery of financial impropriety, all marital assets revert to separate ownership, and Julian's shares are frozen pending investigation." Margaret looked up. "Has the SEC been notified?" Raymond paused. "The SEC received Julian's self-report at 11:47 p.m. last night. He chose to file himself." The room went still. I leaned forward against the glass, watching Julian's face. He hadn't looked up once during the entire presentation. His hands were folded on the table in front of him, perfectly still. He'd taken the honorable exit. He'd filed within the 24-hour window I'd given him. "Prenuptial agreement activated," Margaret said, her voice flat. "All shares frozen pending investigation. The question before this council is whether Julian Ashford remains CEO of Vance Capital during the SEC investigation, or if we remove him immediately." "Remove him," one of the external advisors said. "The publicity alone will destroy investor confidence." "Agreed," said another board member. Margaret looked directly at Julian. "Do you have anything to say?" He shook his head. "No." "Then we vote." The vote was unanimous. Julian Ashford, CEO of Vance Capital for 9 years, architect of a billion-dollar empire built on fraud and stolen inheritance, was removed from his position, effective immediately. Security escorted him from the building 6 minutes later. He walked past the gallery window without looking at me. Raymond found me in the hallway after the board members dispersed. "It's done," he said quietly. I nodded. "Floor 3 complete. Julian's financial empire dismantled his CEO position, gone the SEC investigation underway, the stolen 12 million frozen, and flagged for employee restitution. But we both knew the final floor remained. The Vermont Council vote was scheduled for 6 p.m. tonight. The $47 million ecological fund my mother had created the legacy. Victoria and Julian had tried to bury the last measure of whether Martha Mercer's lifework would survive or die. Raymond closed the file folder in his hands. The boardroom behind us was empty now, the CEO chair vacant, the company Julian had built teetering on the edge of collapse. 6 hours, I said. He met my eyes. 6 hours. Jerome's text arrived at 9 a.m. Surprise witness at the courthouse in 1 hour. The Vermont Council had voted the night before 6 p.m. November 15th, exactly as scheduled. But the results were sealed pending final administrative review, a procedural formality that would take another 72 hours. Raymond had called at midnight to tell me the vote was complete, but the outcome remained locked behind bureaucratic process. So I waited suspended between floors 3 and 4, while the legal machinery ground forward on a different track entirely. The Manhattan Federal Courthouse steps were crowded with media when I arrived at 10:15. Victoria's indictment hearing had been scheduled for weeks, but the surprise witness Jerome mentioned had transformed routine proceedings into a spectacle. News vans lined the street. Photographers clustered near the entrance. Inside the courtroom was sterile and cold. Victoria sat at the defense table beside two attorneys in matching navy suits. She didn't look at me when I took a seat in the gallery. The prosecutor stood. The United States calls Dr. Chloe DuPont. I straightened in my seat. Chloe walked to the stand, looking exactly as she had on our video call 3 weeks earlier, precise, composed, carrying the moral weight of someone who'd flown across an ocean not for money, but because she'd seen Prescott's fraud kill someone else and refused to stay silent. Dr. DuPont, the prosecutor said, can you confirm these are the authentic surgical records from October 2022? She examined the documents for 30 seconds. Yes. These are the authentic Geneva International Medical Center records documenting Victoria Sinclair's hysterectomy in March 2020. The submitted insurance documents claiming pregnancy loss are biologically impossible based on this surgical history. The defense attorney objected. The judge overruled. Dr. DuPont continued. The forged records minimized the severity of injuries, eliminated documentation of smoke inhalation treatment, and backdated the discharge summary to make it appear Ms. Mercer required minimal medical intervention. The authentic records show 3 days of hospitalization, respiratory therapy, surgical debridement, and a 6-week recovery protocol. Victoria's face went white. I felt nothing, just numbers closing. Dr. Prescott testified next as cooperating witness, walking the court through the exact process of how Victoria had paid him to create the forgeries, how he'd submitted them to the insurance company, how the false documentation had been used to deny my counterclaim and award Victoria $375,000. The judge reviewed the evidence for 11 minutes. Then she spoke. The defendant is hereby indicted on 3 federal counts: insurance fraud, perjury, and conspiracy to commit fraud. Bail is set at $500,000. Trial date to be determined. Victoria stood motionless as the courtroom erupted in whispered conversation. The media photographed her from every angle, the socialite who'd built an empire on philanthropy and grace, now facing federal charges that carried a maximum sentence of 15 years. I walked out of the courthouse without waiting for Jerome. The November air was sharp and clean. I took the subway home. Julian arrived at my midtown rental apartment at 8 p.m. I hadn't invited him, but the doorman let him up anyway. Old habits from when we were married, old assumptions about access and permission. He stood in my doorway looking exhausted. Are you happy now? Is this what you wanted? I gestured for him to come in. He sat on the couch, the same one I'd bought after leaving the Greenwich estate, the furniture of a life he'd never been part of. Victoria's indicted, he said. My father's under SEC investigation. The company I built is falling apart. The council vote is sealed, but Raymond thinks it went through. And you? He stopped, shook his head. I don't even know what you are anymore. I'm someone who survived by destroying everyone around you. I sat across from him in the chair by the window. You think this was about destruction? Wasn't it? You tell me, Julian. You're the one who started it. You orchestrated everything, the drugging, the manipulation, the systematic takedown of Victoria's life. You said it was for me. So answer your own question, was it about destruction, or was it about justice? He looked at me like I'd struck him. I was trying to help you. No, you were trying to help yourself. You felt guilty for what your family did to my grandmas. For what Victoria did to me, for every time you looked the other way, while they stole from the people who trusted them. So you built this elaborate revenge campaign and told yourself it was for my healing. That's not. If she goes to prison for 10 years, does it erase my 2 years in that facility? Does it undo the fire, the forged records, the stolen inheritance? You did this for yourself, not me. The silence stretched between us like a canyon. When did I stop needing his vengeance to replace mine? Then why did you help? He asked quietly. If you knew it was for me, why did you participate? Because I needed the truth exposed. I needed the evidence, the connections, the access you could provide. But I never needed to watch Victoria burn to feel whole again. That's the difference between us. So you're happy. I'm happy because I don't need to see it to keep living. That's the difference. He stood slowly like a man carrying weight I couldn't see. What happens now? The council announces their decision in 3 days. You rebuild what's left of your life. Victoria faces trial. And I paused, looking out the window at the city lights. I start the part that comes after revenge ends. Julian stood in the doorway looking at me like I was someone he'd never met. Then he left without another word. I turned to the window. Outside, the city moved forward like it always does. Cars streaming through intersections. People walking home from late shifts. Lights turning on in apartment buildings where other lives were unfolding in their own complicated patterns. I heard it clearly, the sound of a new page starting. The Vermont Council's sealed decision still waited. One final accounting remained. But standing there in my apartment, that I'd chosen in the life I'd rebuilt from the ruins of what they'd tried to destroy, I understood something Julian never would. Revenge didn't heal me, survival did. The notary's office smelled like old paper and weak coffee. 72 hours had passed since the Vermont Council's sealed vote. The administrative review continued behind closed doors, while I handled the accounting that didn't require their approval, ending the marriage that had never really begun. The notary public sat behind a desk, stacked with manila folders and a computer monitor that looked a decade old. He was 62, a man who'd spent 37 years witnessing people sign away their lives in ink. Jerome Kane, my trusted attorney, stood by the window, arms crossed, watching the street below. He'd insisted on being present for this, said he wanted to witness the moment Julian's world officially ended. I sat down. The divorce petition was 32 pages long, most of it legal language that reduced 4 years of marriage to clauses about asset division and liability separation. Sign here, here, and initial here, the notary said, sliding the pages toward me with practiced precision. The prenuptial transfer is automatic upon filing. I signed. My handwriting looked smaller than I remembered. The shares are worth $18.4 million at current frozen valuation. He continued, flipping to page 17. Upon divorce filing, your prenuptial agreement stipulates automatic transfer of all spousal shares to the non-culpable party. Since Mr. Ashford is under SEC investigation for fraud, you're designated non-culpable. $18.4 million. The number sat there between us, like a physical thing. Julian's frozen Vance capital shares the remnants of an empire built on stolen inheritance and employee retirement theft, now legally mine. The prenup I'd signed 4 years ago, the one Julian insisted on to protect his assets from me, had become the mechanism that transferred everything to my name. I picked up my wedding ring and set it on the desk. The gold caught the fluorescent light. The ring sat there, gold and empty, like a promise that stopped meaning anything. I won't be keeping them, I said. Jerome Kane looked up from the paperwork. I'm sorry. The shares, I won't be keeping them. Jerome Castellano turned from the window. What are you talking about? I looked at the divorce papers, at my signature, making it official. Jerome, how quickly can you process a share transfer? Depends on the recipient and the amount. Why? Because I want those $18.4 million liquidated and transferred today. He walked over to the desk, expression unreadable. Transferred where? The 340 Vance Capital employees whose retirement funds Julian stole. All proceeds to the restoration fund. Every dollar. Jerome Kane's pen stopped moving. Jerome Castellano stared at me like I'd started speaking a language he didn't recognize. That's $18 million you're walking away from, Castellano said quietly. I'm not walking away from anything. I'm walking towards something that doesn't need his money. Kala. Julian stole 12 million from those employees' retirement accounts. The government will eventually recover some of it through the SEC investigation, but that could take years, maybe decades. Some of those people are in their 60s, they don't have decades. I stood up, leaving the wedding ring on the desk beside the divorce papers. The 18.4 million covers, the stolen 12 million plus, an additional 6.4 million in compensation for what they lost. Interest, investment growth, the years they spent wondering if they'd be able to retire. It's not perfect restitution, but it's immediate. What's heavier, $18 million or one wedding ring? You're sure about this? Castellano asked. I've never been more sure of anything. He pulled out his phone, already dialing. I'll need their names, account numbers, and distribution formulas. It'll take me 6 hours to set up the fund structure and execute the transfers. Do it. Jerome Kane finished notarizing the divorce papers in silence. When he handed me the final copy, he said, I've been doing this for 37 years. I've never seen anyone walk away from $18 million, Daniel said. I'm not walking away, I'm walking free. I left the wedding ring on his desk, let him figure out what to do with it. Gold could be recycled. Promises couldn't. Outside, Jerome stopped me on the sidewalk. The Vermont Council's decision comes through tomorrow. Raymond got the notice this morning, administrative review, complete results announced at noon. And he doesn't know which way they voted. But either way, you just gave away $18 million. I gave away Julian's money. There's a difference. He studied my face for a long moment. You really don't care about the money. I care about what it represents. Those 340 employees spent years thinking Julian Ashford was a legitimate businessman who made an unfortunate mistake. Now they'll know someone decided their stolen retirement mattered more than revenge money. That matters. What if the council denies your mother's fund tomorrow? What if you end up with nothing? Then I end up with nothing, but I'll end up with it honestly. He shook his head, almost smiling. You're either the smartest person I've ever met or the most naive. Maybe both. I walked away from the notary's office, from the divorce papers that made me legally free from the $18.4 million I'd owned, for exactly 47 minutes before giving it to people who'd earned it through years of honest work. Behind me, a wedding ring on a desk. A marriage dissolved. A fortune transferred to 340 strangers who'd never known my name was on the restoration fund. Ahead, my mother's ecological fund awaiting the council's verdict, and a life that was finally completely mine. The November air was cold and clean. I breathed it in. The woman who left was lighter than the one who entered. Tomorrow the Vermont Council would announce whether Martha Mercer's legacy survived or died. Tomorrow I'd learn if the $47 million fund she'd built for ecological preservation would be restored to its original purpose, or remain buried in Julian and Victoria's bureaucratic sabotage. But today I was free, and that was enough. The SEC ruling came down on a Tuesday in January, no prison time but professional annihilation. 2 months had passed since I'd signed the divorce papers and walked out of that notary's office with nothing but freedom. The Vermont Council's decision had arrived exactly when Jerome Castellano predicted noon, the day after I left my wedding ring on Jerome Kane's desk. The vote was unanimous: approve Martha Mercer's $47 million ecological preservation fund and restore it to its original charter purpose. My grandmother's legacy would survive, but Julian's wouldn't. The Securities and Exchange Commission issued their final ruling on a cold Tuesday morning. I read it in my midtown apartment over coffee that had gone lukewarm while I parsed the legal language. Julian Ashford received no prison time in exchange for his cooperation and self-reporting, but the SEC stripped him of everything that had defined his existence for 23 years. 5-year ban from the securities industry, all series licenses revoked, permanent prohibition from serving as officer or director of any publicly traded company, civil damages totaling $8.3 million. Mandatory disgorgement of ill-gotten gains, and a published ruling that would appear in every background check, every Google search, every professional database for the rest of his life. Jerome Castellano called that afternoon. He's working in compliance consulting in Edison, New Jersey, $43,000 a year. I stood at my window watching Manhattan traffic move in patterns that never changed. What kind of compliance? Anti-money laundering reviews for a mid-sized insurance firm. Windowless office in a low-rise building off Route 1. He arrives at 8, leaves at 5, eats lunch at his desk. Does he know I asked you to check? No, and I won't tell him unless you want me to. I don't. Silence stretched across the line. Then Jerome said quietly, everything he built his identity on gone, but he's free. That was his choice. I got to stay out of prison. He just has to live in a different kind of cage. Julian Ashford, who'd commanded billion-dollar portfolios, who'd sat on charity boards and country club committees, who'd been photographed at galas and quoted in financial journals, now spent his days reviewing transaction reports in a New Jersey office building that smelled like burnt coffee and commercial carpet cleaner. No prison bars, no orange jumpsuit, no shared cell with strangers, just a $43,000 salary, a studio apartment in a town where nobody knew his name, and the knowledge that every door that used to open automatically now stayed permanently closed. The irony was almost perfect. Victoria got criminal prosecution and federal indictment. Julian got civil sanctions and social death. Both of them faced versions of prison. Hers had walls, he had mirrors. I didn't feel triumphant, I felt complete. At the center of it all stood my grandmother's cabinet's burial site exactly as she'd left it. The builders had preserved it, according to the council's specifications. Original logs, original foundation, original view of the mountain ridge that rose behind it like a promise the earth had kept. Jerome Kane found me standing on the cabin's small porch. He'd driven up from Manhattan for the day, said he wanted to see what $47 million looked like when it turned into something real. You miss Manhattan at all? He asked, leaning against the porch railing. I looked out at the construction, at the forest beyond it, at the mountains that held this valley like hands cupping water. Not in a way that makes me want back. What does that mean? It means I miss the version of myself who thought Manhattan mattered, but I don't want to be her again. He nodded slowly. Are you planning to stay up here? Eventually. Right now, I'm consulting with the research director on my grandmother's original proposals. She had 14 years of ecological data that the council buried when they tried to kill the fund. We're turning it into the foundation for the center's first 5 research initiatives. Your mother would be proud. My grandmother would tell me to stop talking and get my hands dirty. I stepped off the porch and knelt in the Vermont soil. My hands touched earth that smelled like pine needles and decades of leaves decomposing into nutrients. It felt like coming home to a place I'd never lived. My grandmother's voice came back to me. A memory from childhood, standing in this same spot, while she explained why she'd chosen this land. Land never betrays Kala. People do. Land just grows. She'd been right about that. People had betrayed her, Julian, Victoria, the council members who'd voted to bury her work. But the land kept growing. The forests she'd studied continued their slow cycles of death and rebirth. The ecological systems she'd documented kept functioning whether anyone cared or not. And now finally her work will continue. The construction crew raised the sign at the entrance, while Jerome and I watched from the cabin porch. Heavy machinery lifted the wooden structure into place, 12 feet tall, carved from Vermont maple letters, painted in forest green. Martha's Ground Ecological Research Center. Established 2023. In memory of Martha Mercer, 1962. Thijirhat. One more piece remains before this story ends, I said. Jerome looked at me. What piece? The people who matter most. The 340 employees who got their retirement back. They didn't know my name was on the restoration fund. I need to decide if they ever should. The afternoon sun caught the sign's letters, turning them gold against the green. My grandmother's cabinet's burial site sat quiet at the center of it all, exactly where she'd left it, exactly where it belonged. Revenge had brought me here. Revenge and survival, and the systematic dismantling of people who'd built their lives on theft and lies. But standing here in the place my mother had loved, watching her legacy take physical form in buildings and earth and preserved forest, I understood something I hadn't known when this started. Revenge wasn't the point, it never had been. Recovery was. And recovery meant more than destroying the people who'd hurt me. It meant building something that outlasted the hurt itself. The sign stood solid against Vermont sky. Martha's Ground. One more piece remained. 3 years after the divorce, I found a white orchid and an envelope at my gate. I decided not to tell the 340 employees. They didn't need to know my name to receive justice. The restoration fund existed. Their accounts were whole. That was enough. Martha's Ground had grown beyond imagination. The research center hosted visiting scientists from 14 countries. Educational programs brought 2,000 school children through each year. My grandmother's ecological data had become the foundation for climate adaptation studies cited in peer-reviewed journals. And I'd become someone who lived quietly in Vermont, taught ecology seminars twice monthly, and knew my neighbors' names. The white orchid sat in a terracotta pot at the entrance gate. Beside it, a manila envelope with no return address, just clean paper sealed with care. Inside was the deed to Plot 347B at Calvary Cemetery in Queens, my grandmother's burial site. The memorial I'd visited twice in 8 years because it hurt to stand on land the Ashfords controlled. Now it was mine, transferred, notarized, complete. Jerome Castellano sent the article clipping 3 days later. Someone had left it under the orchid pot. Martha's Ground receives National Sustainability Award. The photo showed me kneeling in Vermont soil, hands dirty, genuinely smiling, while explaining forest succession to 8th graders. The caption identified me as Director of Educational Programs. No mention of Julian Ashford or Greenwich Estates or federal investigations, just a woman doing work that mattered. Julian must have seen it. Must have read the article in his Brooklyn studio apartment where nobody recognized fallen billionaires. I held the cemetery deed, paper that cost him 2 years. Paper that gave me Martha forever. I'm at $43,000 annually, doing compliance consulting in New Jersey. After taxes, rent expenses, maybe $10,000 saved per year. $20,000 total. 2 years of his reduced life saying no to everything except necessities. 2 years planning this single gesture. He must have known I'd understand. Or maybe he just needed to give back something he'd taken. I reconstructed it later, piecing together the timeline from clues Jerome helped me find. Julian saw the article in early January 2026. Contacted the Ashford family attorney. Spent months navigating legal requirements, family objections, transfer paperwork. By April, he owned the one thing I'd wanted, but could never ask for permanent control of my mother's resting place. Then he drove 4 hours from Brooklyn to Vermont on a Thursday morning in early spring. I wasn't supposed to be at the gate that morning. But my neighbor's daughter, 8 years old, fascinated by plants, had asked to help prepare the entrance garden for spring planting. We'd been working together for an hour, laughing while we turned soil, talking about which native flowers would bloom first, debating whether frost danger had passed. "Will the flowers bloom in spring?" the child asked. "Yes, if we're patient," I said. Julian must have been watching from behind the maple tree 60 feet away. I found his footprints, later dress shoes, not hiking boots, pressed deep into mud soft from morning rain. He stood there while I gardened with a neighbor's child, while I smiled without pretense, while I existed in a life completely separate from anything he'd known or destroyed. He watched me being happy. That must have been harder than any SEC ruling. Then he walked to the gate, placed the white orchid and envelope on the ground with trembling hands, and left without making a sound. Is it redemption if you never ask to be redeemed? I thought about that question for days after Jerome told me about the footprints, after I understood Julian had been there watching my ordinary morning unfold like something sacred. Redemption required acknowledgement. Required the person you'd harmed to witness your contrition and choose whether to grant forgiveness. But Julian hadn't knocked, hadn't called my name, hadn't left a note explaining why or asking for anything in return. He'd simply given me the cemetery deed, the one thing I couldn't take through revenge or legal maneuvering, the one piece of my grandmother's legacy that had remained beyond my reach and disappeared back into his Brooklyn life. No request for forgiveness, no expectation of reconciliation, no claim to moral credit, just an act, clean and complete. The white orchid bloomed for 6 weeks. I watered it every morning, moved it inside when temperature dropped at night, watched its delicate petals hold their shape against Vermont weather that shouldn't have supported such fragile beauty. When it faded, I composted it carefully, mixing spent petals into soil that would feed next season's native plants. Everything returns to earth eventually, even gestures, even surrender. I knelt at the gate where he'd left the orchid, touching ground where the pot had sat. The mud was soft from recent rain, the same mud that had captured his footprints weeks earlier. Vermont earth that didn't care about Manhattan fortunes, or federal indictments, or 3-year-old divorces. Julian had driven 4 hours to give me what I'd already won through systematic revenge, peaceland my mother's memory secured. But the cemetery deed was different. That was something revenge couldn't reach. Something that required him to choose surrender without being forced. The only thing he had left to offer was the one thing I'd never thought to demand. I touched the place where the orchid had been. Soft earth alive with spring impossibly clean despite the mud. He'd given me control of Martha's grave. Given me the permanent right to tend her memorial, to plant flowers. She would have loved to ensure her resting place stayed beautiful even after I was gone. The last piece of my mother, he'd had any claim to hand it over without conditions. It wasn't redemption. Redemption required conversation, forgiveness, mutual recognition of harm and healing. This was simpler, quieter, more honest. This was just a man who'd run out of everything except the truth. She was happy without him, and nothing he could do would change that. So he gave her the one thing she couldn't take, and then he left. The morning after I found the orchid, I went back to the gate. Not to look for him. The footprints in the mud had told me everything I needed to know. Dress shoes, not hiking boots, pressed deep into soft earth. Someone who had stood still for a long time, then walked away without knocking. I knelt and pressed my palm flat against the ground where the terracotta pot had rested. The soil was darker there, still holding the shape of something that had been placed with care. Vermont earth in early spring, cold, damp, alive in ways that had nothing to do with anyone's intentions. I stayed kneeling until my knees ached. Then I stood, brushed the dirt from my hands, and walked to Jerome Castellanos' number in my phone. "The orchid arrived," I said when he answered. "The cemetery deed too." "I know, you okay?" "I need you to cancel my claim to civil damages. The 8.3 million from Julian's SEC settlement, all of it, today." Silence. "Then, that's your legal right. You don't have to." "I know I don't have to. Cancel it." Another pause. "Can I ask why?" I looked out at Martha's ground, the research buildings rising from soil she'd spent 40 years protecting, the forest beyond the tree line, cycling through its slow seasons without anyone's permission. "Some debts can't be paid back," I said. "That's the only lesson worth keeping." He filed the paperwork that afternoon. My neighbor's daughter arrived at the garden an hour before sunset, 8 years old, and already more interested in soil composition than anything she learned in school. We watered the new plantings together, the native wildflowers, the bee balm, and the white orchid sitting among them, fragile and out of place, and somehow still standing. "Who gave you the orchid, Miss Calla?" she asked. "Someone who finally understood something important." But I understood it was too late to change anything. What did they understand? I handed her the watering can, watched her pour carefully around the roots. That some things once broken by betrayal can only be released. Not repaired, not bought back, just released. She considered this with the seriousness that 8-year-olds reserve for questions that actually matter. "Did you release them?" "Yes." "Are you sad?" The sun was dropping behind the mountain ridge, turning the sky the color of embers. The orchid caught the last of the light and held it for a moment before the shadows came. "No," I said, "I'm not sad at all." The loop closes. Peace. And to you listening to my story, remember this. Revenge might feel like justice at first, but peace is what sets you free. I spent 730 days in prison, planning how to destroy the people who stole my grandmother's legacy. And I did it systematically. Victoria faces federal charges. Julian lost everything. The 47 million they stole now funds the ecological center my mother dreamed of. But here's what I learned: the real victory wasn't watching them fall. It was planting that white orchid in Vermont soil and realizing I didn't need their suffering to feel whole. Don't make my mistake. Don't spend years consumed by what was taken. Yes, pursue justice, expose the truth, protect others. But don't confuse revenge with healing. I gave away $18 million because I finally understood betrayal's cost can't be bought back, only released. I believe God allows us to walk through fire, sometimes not as punishment, but as transformation. 2 years in prison taught me patience I never would have chosen. Family betrayal showed me who I was when everything was stripped away. Standing here now at Martha's ground, I understand justice isn't making them pay. It's building something that outlasts the pain. Have you ever chosen between revenge and peace? What did you learn? Drop a comment. Your story might help someone else today. If this resonated, please share it with someone walking through fire. And for more stories like this, subscribe to herdramastories. Thank you for staying until the end. Final note: some details here are fictionalized to protect privacy and deepen the message. What matters is whether the truth reaches your heart.